January 8th, 2025. Kodiak Bear mauls police officers responding to cabin break-in. The call came in at 11:47 a.m. on what had started as another routine Tuesday morning in Homer, Alaska. Dispatch operator Sarah McKinnon had been working the morning shift at the Kenai Peninsula Borough Emergency Communications Center for 7 years, and she thought she'd heard everything the last frontier could throw at her. Domestic disputes, vehicle accidents on the icy Sterling Highway, fishing boat emergencies in Kachemak Bay, even the occasional moose wandering through downtown. But when the trembling voice of Martha Hendricks crackled through her headset that frigid January morning, Sarah knew immediately this was different. 911, what's your emergency? Sarah's practiced voice carried the calm authority that had guided hundreds of frightened callers through their worst moments. The digital clock on her console read 11:47:23 as she began typing the incident report that would soon become the most horrific case file in the Homer Police Department's 43-year history. There's something in my cabin," Martha whispered, her voice barely audible above the static of what sounded like a satellite phone connection. Oh God, it's huge. I can hear it moving around downstairs. Please, you have to send someone." Martha Hendricks was 72 years old, a retired librarian from Anchorage who had purchased the small log cabin on Crossman Ridge 3 years earlier as a weekend retreat. She lived alone since her husband Carl passed in 2022, finding solace in the remote cabin's spectacular views of Kachemak Bay and the Kenai Mountains beyond. The property sat at the end of a winding gravel road, 15 miles northeast of Homer proper, accessible only by four-wheel drive during the best of conditions. In January, with 3 feet of snow blanketing the peninsula and temperatures hovering near zero, the isolation was complete. "Mom, can you tell me your exact location?" Sarah's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up the enhanced 911 database that would pinpoint Martha's coordinates through her satellite phone's GPS transponder. "It's 4847 Crossman Ridge Road." Martha's voice shook with terror. "The old Henderson place. I bought it from his estate. Please hurry. I can hear it breaking things downstairs. The whole cabin's shaking." The address populated on Sarah's screen, along with a detailed property map showing the remote location. Cross-referencing with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game's Bear Activity database, she felt her stomach drop. The entire Crossman Ridge area had been flagged as high activity zone for both black bears and brown bears throughout the winter months. Several residents had reported unusual bear behavior in recent weeks, including daylight raids on cabins and aggressive encounters with humans. The unusually mild December had disrupted normal hibernation patterns across the Kenai Peninsula. "Martha, I need you to stay on the line with me," Sarah said, activating the priority alert system that would simultaneously notify Homer Police, Alaska State Troopers, and Fish and Game Enforcement. "Are you in a secure location right now?" "I'm upstairs in my bedroom. I locked the door, but it's just a regular door lock. If it wants to get up here." Martha's voice trailed off as a tremendous crash echoed through the phone, followed by what sounded like splintering wood and glass. Sarah had dispatched thousands of calls during her career, but the primal terror in Martha's voice sent chills down her spine. She glanced at the deployment board showing available units. Officer Mark Jensen was Patrol Unit 7, currently listed as available and positioned near the Spit Road intersection. Officer Linda Flores was Unit 12, just finishing a routine traffic stop on Pioneer Avenue. Both were experienced officers, but Sarah wondered if anyone could truly be prepared for what they might encounter at the Henderson cabin. "Martha, help is on the way," Sarah assured her, though she could hear her own voice wavering slightly. "2 officers are responding right now. I need you to stay exactly where you are and keep this line open." The crash of breaking furniture came through the phone again, louder this time, followed by a sound that made Sarah's blood run cold. A deep, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the cabin. In her 7 years of emergency dispatch, she had never heard anything like it. Officer Mark Jensen was 34 years old and had been with the Homer Police Department for 9 years. A former Marine who served 2 tours in Afghanistan, he thought he had left the worst dangers behind when he returned to his hometown of Homer to join the force. Mark was married to Jennifer, a nurse at South Peninsula Hospital, and they had twin daughters, Emma and Sophie, who were 7 years old. Every morning when he kissed them goodbye before his shift, Jennifer would remind him to be careful out there. It had become their daily ritual, a gentle acknowledgement of the risks inherent in police work, even in a small Alaska town. Mark's patrol area included the remote sections of road leading up into the foothills and along Crossman Ridge. He knew the territory well, having grown up hunting and fishing these very mountains with his father. He understood the wildlife, respected the bears, and had encountered them numerous times during his patrols. Most interactions were routine: bears crossing roads, raiding garbage cans, or wandering too close to residential areas. Standard protocol was to use noisemakers, establish distance, and call fish and game if the animal appeared aggressive or habituated to humans. When the priority call came through his radio at 11:49 a.m., Mark was completing paperwork from a minor fender bender near the small boat harbor. The urgency in dispatch's voice immediately commanded his attention. Unit 7, respond priority to 4847 Crossman Ridge Road for a possible breaking and entering in progress. Caller reports large animal inside residence. Approach with extreme caution. Mark's familiarity with the area told him exactly where he was heading. The old Henderson cabin had been empty for nearly 4 years before Martha Hendricks purchased it. Vacant properties in bear country were magnets for wildlife, especially during harsh winter months when natural food sources were scarce. He had responded to similar calls before, bears that had broken into cabins seeking food, causing thousands of dollars in damage, but typically fleeing when humans arrived. Unit 7 en route, Mark responded, activating his emergency lights and pulling onto the Sterling Highway. ETA approximately 12 minutes. The drive up Crossman Ridge Road would take him through increasingly remote terrain. The gravel road wound through dense stands of Sitka spruce and hemlock, climbing steadily into the foothills. During summer months, the route offered spectacular views of Kachemak Bay, but in January it was a treacherous passage through a frozen wilderness where cell phone coverage was spotty and the nearest neighbor was miles away. Officer Linda Flores was 28 years old and had been with Homer Police for 4 years. Originally from Fairbanks, she had moved to Homer after completing her criminal justice degree at the University of Alaska, Anchorage. Linda was drawn to Homer by its reputation as a close-knit community where police officers could truly make a difference in people's lives. She was single, lived in a small apartment overlooking Bishop's Beach, and spent her off-duty hours hiking, kayaking, and training for marathons. Linda was known throughout the department for her calm demeanor under pressure and her thorough approach to investigations. She had encountered bears during her patrols, but always from a safe distance. Her training had emphasized the importance of bear safety, and she carried bear spray in addition to her standard equipment. Like all Homer officers, she understood that wildlife encounters were an occupational hazard in Alaska. When the priority dispatch came through, Linda was wrapping up a routine traffic stop on a tourist who had been driving too slowly on Pioneer Avenue, backing up traffic and creating a safety hazard. She had just handed back the driver's license with a verbal warning when her radio crackled to life. Unit 12, respond priority to 4847 Crossman Ridge Road to assist Unit 7. Possible bear inside residence with occupant trapped upstairs. The specificity of the call immediately elevated Linda's concern. Most bear calls were property damage reports filed after the fact or sightings that required monitoring. An active situation with a trapped civilian was entirely different. She quickly concluded her traffic stop and activated her emergency equipment. "Unit 12 en route," she radioed back. "ETA 15 minutes. Linda's route would take her through downtown Homer before connecting with East End Road and eventually Crossman Ridge Road. As she drove through the familiar streets of her adopted hometown, past the fishing supply stores and tourist shops that defined Homer's economy, she couldn't shake the feeling that this call was different from anything she had encountered before. The small community of Homer, Alaska, population 5,500, sits on a narrow strip of land extending into Kachemak Bay like a pointing finger. Known worldwide for its halibut fishing and spectacular natural beauty, Homer attracts thousands of tourists each summer who come to experience Alaska's wilderness. But during the long winter months, the town transforms into an isolated outpost where residents depend on each other for survival and where the forces of nature reign supreme. The area surrounding Homer is prime habitat for both black bears and brown bears, including the massive coastal brown bears that can weigh up to 1,500 pounds. These apex predators typically hibernate from November through March, denning in caves or excavated sites in the mountains above town. However, climate change and unpredictable weather patterns had begun disrupting traditional hibernation cycles throughout Alaska. Warmer than normal winters caused some bears to emerge early or remain active throughout the season, creating dangerous encounters with humans in areas where people had grown accustomed to winter months being bear-free. Dr. Michael Thornton, a wildlife biologist with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, had been monitoring bear activity on the Kenai Peninsula for 15 years. His research station was located just 8 miles from Crossman Ridge, and his recent reports had been increasingly alarming. The unusually warm December of 2024 had caused significant disruption to bear denning behavior. Several tagged bears that should have been deep in hibernation were instead wandering their territories, searching for food in a landscape locked under snow and ice. "We're seeing behavior patterns that are completely outside the normal range," Dr. Thornton had written in his December monthly report. "Bears that should be in deep hibernation are actively foraging, becoming increasingly bold in their interactions with human infrastructure. The combination of food scarcity and disrupted sleep cycles is creating a potentially explosive situation." Crossman Ridge itself was a geological formation rising nearly 2,000 feet above sea level, covered in dense coastal rainforest that provided ideal bear habitat. Salmon runs in the streams below the ridge attracted bears during summer months, while the abundance of berry bushes and other vegetation sustained them through the fall. The area had been home to both black bears and brown bears for thousands of years, long before humans began building cabins and roads through their territory. The Henderson cabin that Martha Hendricks had purchased sat on a 5-acre parcel carved out of this wilderness. Built in 1987 by Harold Henderson, a retired commercial fisherman, the structure was a classic Alaska log cabin design. 2 stories, approximately 1,200 square feet, with a steep metal roof designed to shed heavy snow loads. The lower level contained a kitchen, living room and bathroom, while the upper level held 2 bedrooms and a small office area. A wraparound porch offered commanding views of Kachemak Bay and the volcanic peaks beyond. Harold Henderson had lived in the cabin for 35 years before his death in 2021. He was known as a meticulous man who maintained his property with military precision, always ensuring that garbage was properly secured and bird feeders were taken down during bear season. After his death, the property sat vacant for nearly 3 years while his estate was settled. During that time, nature began its inevitable reclamation process. The vacancy period had not gone unnoticed by the local wildlife. Bears, both black and brown, had investigated the property numerous times. Evidence of their visits was scattered around the cabin: claw marks on the porch railings, damaged garbage cans, and tracks in the muddy areas around the foundation. However, Harold's solid construction and proper bear-proofing had kept the animals from gaining access to the interior. When Martha Hendricks purchased the property in October 2024, she had been charmed by its rustic beauty and the sense of solitude it offered. A long-time resident of Anchorage who had grown weary of city life, Martha saw the cabin as her opportunity to live the quintessential Alaska dream. She had some experience with wilderness living from camping trips with her late husband, but nothing had prepared her for the harsh realities of winter in bear country. Martha's first months at the cabin had been peaceful. She spent her days reading by the wood stove, taking short walks along established trails, and enjoying the spectacular sunsets over Kachemak Bay. She had seen bear tracks in the snow around her property, but considered them simply part of the Alaska experience. The previous owner had left detailed notes about bear safety, including instructions for the proper storage of food and garbage, but Martha had perhaps grown complacent during the quiet months. The morning of January 8, 2025, had begun like many others for Martha. She woke at 6:30 a.m. to the sound of wind rattling the cabin's metal roof. The temperature gauge outside her bedroom window read -4 degrees Fahrenheit, typical for early January. After starting a fire in the wood stove and brewing her morning coffee, Martha settled into her favorite chair with a novel, planning to spend the day reading and possibly working on a quilt project she had started the previous week. The first indication that something was wrong came around 11:15 a.m. Martha heard what sounded like something heavy moving around on her front porch. Initially, she assumed it was just wind-blown debris, or perhaps a tree branch that had fallen during the night. However, the sound persisted and seemed to be methodical, as if something was systematically investigating the area around her front door. Concerned, but not yet alarmed, Martha moved to the front window and carefully pulled back the curtain to peer outside. What she saw in the snow-covered yard made her breath catch in her throat. Tracks. Not just any tracks, but massive paw prints that could only belong to one type of animal, a brown bear, and a large one. The tracks circled her cabin in a methodical pattern, as if the animal had been conducting a thorough investigation of the property. Some prints were so fresh that snow had not yet begun to fill them, indicating the bear had been there very recently, possibly within the last hour. The size of the tracks was particularly alarming. Martha estimated the paws to be at least 10 inches long and 6 inches wide, suggesting an animal of enormous proportions. As Martha stood frozen at the window, trying to process what she was seeing, a new sound reached her ears. Heavy breathing, just outside the front door, no more than 15 feet from where she stood. The breathing was deep and rhythmic, occasionally interrupted by what sounded like sniffing or snorting. The bear was not just near her cabin. It was actively investigating the entrance. Martha's hands began to shake as she reached for the satellite phone that was her only means of communication with the outside world. The landline that had once served the Henderson cabin had been disconnected years earlier, and cellular service was non-existent in this remote location. The satellite phone was her lifeline, and as she dialed 911, she prayed that help would arrive before whatever was outside decided to come inside. The bear that was methodically exploring Martha's cabin was a male coastal brown bear, approximately 12 years old and weighing nearly 1,200 pounds. Local Fish and Game records would later identify the animal through DNA analysis as bear number 417, a massive boar that had been tagged and monitored since 2019. This particular bear had a territory that encompassed nearly 50 square miles of the Crossman Ridge area, including the drainage systems and salmon streams that provided his primary food sources during the active months. Bear number 417 had a complex history with human interaction. Unlike many bears that avoided human contact, this animal had demonstrated what wildlife biologists called food conditioning, a behavioral adaptation where bears learn to associate human activity with potential food sources. This conditioning typically occurred when bears successfully raided garbage cans, campsites, or other human food sources, reinforcing the behavior through positive rewards. The bear's conditioning had begun 3 years earlier when he discovered that several cabins in his territory contained easily accessible food during the owner's absences. He had learned that humans often left behind dog food, bird seed, and improperly stored garbage that could sustain him for days. This pattern of behavior had been documented by Dr. Thornton's research team, who had been tracking bear number 417 through GPS collar data and trail cameras throughout the area. What made bear number 417 particularly dangerous was his size, intelligence, and lack of fear regarding humans. Most bears, even large ones, would typically flee when confronted by human presence. However, food-conditioned bears often lose this natural wariness, instead viewing humans as either competitors for resources or simply obstacles to be overcome. When combined with the bear's massive size and strength, this behavioral change created an extremely hazardous situation. The unusually warm December of 2024 had prevented bear number 417 from entering his normal hibernation cycle. Instead of settling into his den site in early November, the bear remained active throughout the winter months, burning through fat reserves that should have sustained him until spring. By January, the animal was experiencing significant nutritional stress, making him increasingly bold and aggressive in his search for food sources. Trail camera footage from Dr. Thornton's research stations would later reveal that bear number 417 had been systematically investigating every cabin and structure within his territory throughout December and early January. The bear's behavior showed remarkable intelligence and persistence. He would spend hours at each location, testing doors, windows, and any potential entry points. Most cabins in the area had been properly bear-proofed, with reinforced doors, secured windows, and all food sources removed or properly stored. Martha's cabin, however, presented a unique opportunity. While Harold Henderson had maintained excellent bear-proofing protocols during his lifetime, the 3-year vacancy period had resulted in some deterioration of the defensive measures. Weather damage had loosened some window frames, and Martha's recent occupancy had introduced new scent trails that attracted the bear's attention. Most critically, Martha had unknowingly violated several basic bear safety protocols that would prove to have devastating consequences. The night before the attack, Martha had prepared a large dinner that included bacon, salmon, and fresh bread. The cooking odors had permeated the cabin and drifted outside through the ventilation system, creating an irresistible scent trail for any bear in the area. Additionally, Martha had placed her garbage bag on the back porch, planning to drive it to the dumpster during her next trip to town. The bag contained food scraps that further enhanced the attractant scents surrounding the cabin. Bear number 417 had likely detected these scent trails from miles away. A brown bear's sense of smell is approximately 7 times more sensitive than a bloodhound's, allowing them to detect food sources from enormous distances. The combination of cooking odors and garbage scents would have been like a beacon drawing the hungry bear directly to Martha's location. As Officer Mark Jensen navigated his patrol vehicle up the increasingly treacherous Crossman Ridge Road, he maintained radio contact with dispatch while mentally preparing for what he might encounter. The road conditions were particularly challenging that morning. Fresh snow from the previous night had not yet been ploughed, and temperatures hovering near zero had created patches of black ice that made driving hazardous even for his four-wheel drive vehicle. "Dispatch, Unit 7, Mark radioed as he passed the 5-mile marker on Crossman Ridge Road. "Road conditions are deteriorating. Request ETA update on backup units." Sarah McKinnon's voice crackled back through the static-filled connection. "Unit 7, Unit 12 is approximately 8 minutes behind your position. Alaska State Troopers have been notified but currently have no available units in the area. Fish and Game Dispatch indicates Enforcement Officer Thompson is en route from Soldotna, ETA, approximately 45 minutes. The information was both reassuring and concerning. Linda Flores was an experienced officer who Mark trusted completely, but the delay in additional backup meant that they would be handling this situation with minimal resources. Wildlife enforcement officers were specifically trained for dangerous animal encounters, but 45 minutes was an eternity in an emergency situation. As Mark continued his climb up the mountain road, he could see the landscape changing around him. The lower elevations around Homer were characterized by relatively open terrain with scattered houses and cleared areas. However, as the road gained elevation, the forest closed in around him. Massive Sitka spruce and western hemlock trees created a dense canopy that blocked much of the already limited winter sunlight, creating an almost tunnel-like effect along the road. This was prime bear habitat, and Mark found himself scanning the tree line on both sides of the road for any signs of movement. He had encountered bears during previous patrols in this area, but always from the safety of his vehicle and typically during summer months when the animals were focused on salmon runs or berry gathering. A winter bear encounter was far more unpredictable and potentially dangerous. The GPS unit in Mark's patrol car indicated he was now within 2 miles of the Henderson cabin. He reduced his speed and activated his emergency lights, both to improve his visibility in the dim forest light and to announce his approach to any wildlife in the area. Most bears would flee from the sight and sound of an approaching vehicle, but Mark understood that he was potentially dealing with an animal that had already demonstrated unusual boldness by entering an occupied dwelling. "Dispatch Unit 7, Mark radioed again. "Approaching target location. Will establish perimeter and assess situation before proceeding, maintaining open radio contact." "Copy Unit 7. Sarah responded. "Caller is still on the line. Reports continued disturbance on the lower level of the residence. No visual contact with the animal at this time." Mark could hear the tension in Dispatcher's voice, and he knew that Sarah was dealing with a situation unlike anything in her experience. Emergency dispatchers trained extensively for medical emergencies, fires, and criminal situations. But wildlife encounters presented unique challenges that required specialized knowledge and equipment. Officer Linda Flores was making equally challenging progress up the mountain road, her patrol vehicle struggling with the combination of snow, ice, and steep grades. As a relative newcomer to Alaska, Linda had learned to respect the state's harsh winter conditions, but this particular drive was testing both her driving skills and her nerves. The isolation of the area was striking. Once she passed the last residential area near the base of Crossman Ridge, Linda encountered no other vehicles, no signs of human activity, and no cell phone coverage. The silence was broken only by the sound of her engine and the occasional crack of tree branches under the weight of accumulated snow. Linda's mind raced through the various scenarios she might encounter at the cabin. Her training had covered basic wildlife safety, but the specific protocols for dealing with a bear inside an occupied structure were limited. The primary objectives were clear: ensure civilian safety, avoid escalating the situation, and wait for specialized wildlife enforcement if possible. However, the reality of an emergency situation might not allow for textbook responses. As she navigated a particularly treacherous curve in the road, Linda's radio crackled to life with an update that sent chills down her spine. All units, be advised that caller reports sounds of breaking glass and continued destructive activity inside the residence. Caller is secured upstairs but reports the animal appears to be moving throughout the lower level of the structure. The escalation was concerning. A bear that was actively destroying property inside a dwelling was demonstrating behavior that was far outside normal parameters. Most bears that accidentally entered buildings would typically seek the nearest exit when they realized they were trapped. Continued destructive activity suggested either extreme hunger, territorial behavior, or possible injury that was affecting the animal's judgment. Linda increased her speed as much as the road conditions would allow, knowing that every minute of delay potentially increased the danger to Martha Hendricks. She could see Mark's emergency lights ahead of her now, indicating that he was nearing the cabin location. Meanwhile, inside the cabin, Martha Hendricks was experiencing the longest minutes of her life. Barricaded in her upstairs bedroom with a flimsy door lock as her only protection, she listened in terror to the systematic destruction of her home below. The bear had apparently gained access through the back door, though Martha couldn't understand how such a massive animal had managed to breach the heavy wooden door that Harold Henderson had installed specifically for security purposes. The sounds from downstairs painted a horrifying picture of destruction. She could hear heavy footsteps moving from room to room, accompanied by the crash of breaking furniture and shattering dishes. At one point, the entire cabin shook as something extremely heavy apparently fell or was thrown across the kitchen. The refrigerator door opened and closed repeatedly, followed by sounds that suggested the bear was investigating its contents. "Ma'am? Are you still there?" Sarah's voice came through the satellite phone, providing Martha's only connection to help and sanity. "Yes, I'm here," Martha whispered, afraid that speaking too loudly might attract the animal's attention to her location. "It's getting worse down there. The whole house is shaking when it moves around. How close are the officers?" "Very close," Sarah assured her. "Officer Jensen should be arriving any moment, with Officer Flores right behind him. I need you to stay exactly where you are and do not come downstairs under any circumstances." Martha gripped the phone tighter, finding some comfort in Sarah's calm voice, even as her world disintegrated around her. The bedroom where she had taken refuge was located at the front of the cabin, with windows that offered a view of the driveway and approach road. If she could see the police officers arrive, at least she would know that help was near. As if in response to her thoughts, Martha heard a new sound from outside, the distant hum of an approaching vehicle, growing steadily louder as it climbed the mountain road toward her cabin. Hope flared in her chest for the first time since the nightmare began. However, at almost the same moment, the sounds from downstairs suddenly ceased. The abrupt silence was somehow more terrifying than the destruction had been. Martha realized that the bear had also heard the approaching vehicle and was now listening, evaluating this new development in its environment. The next few minutes would determine whether the arrival of help would solve the crisis or escalate it into something far worse. Officer Mark Jensen's patrol vehicle emerged from the forest into the small clearing where the Henderson cabin sat, and his first sight of the scene confirmed his worst fears. The cabin looked like a war zone. The back door hung off its hinges, revealing a gaping entrance into the dark interior. Snow around the cabin was trampled and disturbed over a wide area, with massive paw prints leading in every direction. Most alarming of all, there was clear evidence of ongoing activity inside, occasional sounds of movement and destruction that could be heard even through the walls. Mark parked his vehicle approximately 50 yards from the cabin, far enough to maintain safety, but close enough to provide rapid response if needed. He immediately activated his emergency lights and spotlight, illuminating the front of the cabin and announcing his presence to both the trapped civilian and whatever animal was inside. "Dispatch! Unit 7 on scene!" Mark radioed, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. Confirming active bear inside structure. Civilian location unknown, but presumed upstairs based on earlier communications. Establishing perimeter and awaiting backup. Copy, Unit 7, Sarah responded. Unit 12 ETA 3 minutes. Caller confirms she can see your emergency lights and is secured upstairs. The sight of police lights outside the cabin provided Martha with the first genuine relief she had felt since the ordeal began. From her bedroom window, she could see the patrol car's red and blue strobes cutting through the dim winter morning, casting eerie shadows across the snow-covered landscape. The presence of help, even though she remained trapped, gave her hope that this nightmare might soon end. However, the bear's reaction to the new arrival was immediate and concerning. The sounds of destruction from downstairs intensified dramatically, as if the animal was responding to the perceived threat with increased aggression. Heavy footsteps moved rapidly from room to room, accompanied by tremendous crashes that seemed to shake the entire cabin. Mark could hear the escalating activity from inside the building, and he understood that his arrival had changed the dynamic of the situation. Bears under stress often exhibited territorial behavior, and the animal inside might now view the cabin as its den site that needed to be defended against intruders. Drawing on his military experience and police training, Mark began formulating a tactical assessment of the situation. The primary objective was civilian safety, which meant finding a way to extract Martha from the upper level without triggering a confrontation with the bear. However, the animal's position inside the cabin complicated any rescue attempt. Standard protocols called for creating noise and disturbance to encourage the bear to flee, but with a human trapped above, such tactics could inadvertently direct the animal's attention upward. Officer Linda Flores arrived on scene 90 seconds later, parking her vehicle alongside Mark's position and immediately taking in the scope of the emergency. The sight of the damaged cabin and clear evidence of bear activity inside confirmed that this was indeed an unprecedented situation that would require careful coordination and precise execution. Unit 12 on scene, Linda radioed, joining Unit 7 in establishing perimeter. The two officers met at the rear of Mark's patrol car, using the vehicle as cover while they discussed their approach. Both were acutely aware that standard police tactics had little application in this scenario. Their weapons, while potentially effective against human threats, would be inadequate against a 1,000-pound bear unless placed with perfect accuracy under extreme stress. Moreover, discharging firearms near a trapped civilian presented additional risks that had to be carefully considered. "We need to get that woman out of there," Linda said, keeping her voice low to avoid attracting the bear's attention. "But any attempt to enter the cabin puts us in direct confrontation with the animal." Mark nodded, studying the cabin's architecture and considering possible approaches. "The front porch has windows that might give us access to the upper level, but we'd have to get close enough to the building to set up a ladder or rope system." Their tactical discussion was interrupted by a tremendous crash from inside the cabin, followed by a sound that neither officer had heard before, a deep, resonant roar that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath their feet. The sound was primal and terrifying, a vocalization of power and fury that reminded both officers that they were dealing with one of nature's most formidable predators. Inside the cabin, Martha had heard the officer's arrival and felt a surge of hope, but the bear's reaction to their presence was becoming increasingly violent. The animal seemed to be systematically destroying everything in the lower level, and the crashes and roars were growing more frequent and intense. Most frightening of all, Martha began to hear heavy footsteps on the stairway leading to the upper level. The bear was coming upstairs. "They're here! The police are here!" Martha whispered urgently into the satellite phone. "But it's coming up the stairs. It's coming up here." Sarah's voice carried new urgency as she relayed this critical information to the officers on scene. Units 7 and 12, be advised, civilian reports. The animal is now attempting to access the upper level. Immediate intervention may be required. Mark and Linda exchanged glances, understanding that the situation had just crossed from rescue operation to life and death emergency. With the bear actively pursuing the trapped civilian, they could no longer wait for specialized wildlife enforcement or additional backup. They had to act immediately, despite the enormous risks involved. The Henderson cabin's stairway was a narrow, steep structure typical of Alaska log cabin design. Built from solid timber with heavy treads, designed to support the weight of furniture and supplies being carried to the upper level, the stairs were more than capable of supporting even a massive bear. However, the confined space of the stairway could work to the officer's advantage, potentially limiting the animal's movement and providing a predictable line of approach. Mark quickly assessed their equipment options. Both officers carried standard-issue .40 caliber sidearms, adequate for most law enforcement situations, but marginal against a large bear, unless shot placement was perfect. They also carried tasers, pepper spray, and expandable batons, none of which would be effective against an animal of this size. Most importantly, both carried bear spray, a specialized aerosol deterrent that was specifically designed for large bear encounters. "We're going to have to go in," Mark decided, his military training taking over as he formulated a rapid response plan. "You take the front entrance, I'll take the back. We coordinate entry and use noise, lights and bear spray to try to drive the animal away from the stairway." Linda nodded, understanding the plan despite its obvious dangers. Neither officer was trained for interior bear encounters, but the alternative, allowing the animal to reach the trapped civilian, was unacceptable. As they prepared to implement their hastily conceived rescue plan, both officers took a moment to radio their positions and intentions to dispatch, ensuring that their families would know what happened if the situation went wrong. "Dispatch, Units 7 and 12, preparing for immediate entry to extract civilian," Mark radioed. "Animal is actively pursuing civilian to upper level. Cannot wait for additional backup." The response from dispatch carried an emotional weight that was unusual for official communications. "Copy. Units 7 and 12. Use extreme caution. Additional units en route, but ETA still 30 minutes minimum." Sarah McKinnon, listening to the radio traffic from her dispatch console, understood that she was potentially listening to the last communications from two fellow public servants who were about to risk everything to save a stranger's life. The weight of that responsibility and her role in coordinating the response was almost overwhelming. Martha Hendricks, still connected through her satellite phone, could hear the heavy footsteps climbing the wooden stairs with methodical determination. Each step seemed to take forever, but collectively they represented an approaching death that she was powerless to prevent. The flimsy bedroom door that had provided psychological comfort was now revealed as completely inadequate against the force that was approaching. The sound of the officers' vehicles outside had grown quiet, suggesting they were no longer in their cars, but moving on foot. Martha could only hope that they had some plan to help her, because the bear was now at the top of the stairs, just a few feet from her bedroom door. Bear number 417 had reached the upper level of the cabin and was now investigating the new environment with the same methodical approach he had used downstairs. The narrow hallway that connected the two bedrooms and office area was filled with the bear's massive presence, his shoulders actually brushing against both walls as he moved. The scent trail that had originally drawn him to the cabin was now overpowered by the fresh human scent emanating from behind Martha's bedroom door. The bear's behavioral patterns had been shaped by years of successful encounters with human food sources, and his conditioning told him that persistence always led to rewards. The presence of humans outside the cabin was acknowledged but not feared. This animal had learned that humans typically fled when confronted, leaving their food sources behind. The human hiding behind the thin door represented both a potential threat to be neutralized and an obstacle between the bear and whatever food sources might be secured in that room. Martha could hear the bear's breathing just outside her door now, deep and rhythmic, occasionally punctuated by sniffing sounds as the animal processed the scent information. The door handle rattled slightly as something brushed against it, possibly the bear's massive body as he maneuvered in the narrow space. "It's right outside my door," Martha whispered into the phone, her voice barely audible even to herself. "I can hear it breathing." At that exact moment, Officers Jensen and Flores implemented their desperate rescue plan. Mark approached the damaged rear entrance, while Linda moved toward the front door, both officers moving with the tactical precision of their training, despite the unprecedented nature of their mission. The plan was to enter simultaneously, creating maximum noise and confusion to drive the bear away from the upper level and toward one of the exits. Both officers activated their tactical flashlights and prepared their bear spray canisters, understanding that they would have only seconds to execute their plan before the situation devolved into chaos. "On my mark," Mark whispered into his radio. 3, 2, 1, execute." Both officers burst through their respective entrances simultaneously, shouting commands and activating every noise-making device they carried. The effect was immediate and dramatic, the cabin filled with blinding light, deafening noise, and the overlapping voices of two trained professionals attempting to take control of an impossible situation. The bear's reaction was explosive. Rather than fleeing as the officers had hoped, Bear number 417 responded to the perceived threat with the territorial aggression that had been building throughout his investigation of the cabin. The animal's massive form appeared at the top of the stairway, filling the narrow opening and blocking any potential escape route to the upper level. Mark, positioned at the rear entrance, had a clear view up the stairway and found himself face to face with 1,200 pounds of enraged brown bear from a distance of less than 20 feet. The bear's eyes reflected the beam of Mark's tactical light, creating an otherworldly effect that would be burned into his memory for the few remaining minutes of his life. Linda, entering through the front door, was positioned at an angle that gave her a partial view of the stairway and the bear's massive hindquarters. Her training told her to maintain position and coordinate with her partner, but the reality of the situation was already spiraling beyond any tactical protocol. The standoff lasted perhaps 3 seconds, an eternity in tactical time. The bear evaluated the new threats while the officers assessed their options, and Martha, trapped upstairs, listened to the chaos below with a mixture of hope and terror. Then, bear number 417 made his decision. Rather than retreating, the massive animal descended the stairway with surprising speed, his target clearly the officer who had entered through the rear of the cabin. Mark Jensen, veteran of 2 combat tours in Afghanistan, found himself facing an enemy unlike anything in his military experience. The bear's charge down the narrow stairway was like an avalanche of fur, muscle, and fury. Mark had time for one burst from his bear spray canister before the animal was on him, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large. The pepper spray cloud filled the confined space, but did little to deter an animal that was operating on pure territorial aggression. The collision between Mark and the bear occurred near the rear entrance of the cabin, in the kitchen area, where the animal had spent much of his time investigating the refrigerator and cabinets. Mark attempted to maintain distance while drawing his sidearm, but the bear's reach and speed made tactical maneuvering impossible in the confined space. The attack was swift and devastating. The bear's initial blow knocked Mark to the ground with tremendous force, his equipment scattering across the kitchen floor. The animal's massive jaws found their target with predatory precision, and Mark's screams filled the cabin with the sound of human suffering that would haunt Linda Flores for the rest of her life. Linda's position at the front of the cabin gave her a partially obstructed view of the attack, but the sounds alone conveyed the horror of what was happening to her partner. Her training demanded that she take immediate action to assist Mark, but the reality of facing a 1,000-pound predator with only standard police equipment was paralyzing. The bear spray that Linda deployed filled the cabin with an acrid cloud that affected everyone in the confined space: herself, the dying officer, and marginally the bear. The animal's focus on his attack made him temporarily oblivious to the chemical irritant, though it would eventually drive him to seek fresh air and escape from the cabin. Mark Jensen's final radio transmission was barely coherent through his pain and the mechanical damage to his equipment, but the words "Officer down" reached dispatch and confirmed Sarah McKinnon's worst fears. The situation had escalated from rescue operation to officer-involved fatality in a matter of seconds. Linda's tactical training warred with her human instincts as she watched her partner and friend being mauled by an animal that represented everything wild and uncontrollable about Alaska. Her attempts to approach and assist Mark were thwarted by the bear's protective positioning over his victim, and her weapon was inadequate to stop the attack without risking further harm to the fallen officer. The duration of the attack seemed endless, though post-incident analysis would determine that the initial assault lasted less than 2 minutes. When bear number 417 finally released his grip on Mark Jensen, the officer was no longer capable of resistance or escape. The bear's attention then turned to the remaining threat in his territory, Officer Linda Flores. Linda found herself alone in a confined space with a massive predator that had just demonstrated his willingness and ability to kill humans. Her radio communications with dispatch became increasingly desperate as she realized that backup was still 30 minutes away, and that her own survival now depended on decisions she would have to make in the next few seconds. The bear's approach toward Linda was more deliberate than his assault on Mark had been. Having neutralized the primary threat, the animal now moved with the confidence of a predator that had established dominance over his territory. Linda's position near the front door offered potential escape, but retreat would mean abandoning any chance of helping her fallen partner and leaving Martha trapped upstairs with no protection. Linda's decision to stand her ground rather than flee would be analyzed and debated by law enforcement professionals for years afterward. Some would argue that tactical retreat was the only logical choice given the circumstances. Others would maintain that her duty to protect civilian life superseded her own survival. In the moment, however, Linda's decision was based not on tactical analysis, but on the simple refusal to abandon people who were depending on her. The second attack began when bear number 417 closed the distance between himself and Linda in 3 powerful strides. Unlike the confined stairway area where Mark had been trapped, the living room space gave Linda marginally more room to maneuver, but it also gave the bear more space to use his size and speed advantages. Linda's bear spray deployment was more effective than Mark's had been, primarily because she had learned from observing the first attack. The chemical cloud struck the bear directly in the face and eyes, causing him to pause and shake his massive head in irritation. However, the effect was temporary, and the animal's momentum carried him forward into contact with the second officer. The impact drove Linda backward into the cabin's front wall, her body striking the heavy log construction with tremendous force. The bear's weight and power were overwhelming, but Linda's positioning near the door allowed her to partially deflect the animal's charge rather than absorbing its full impact. Unlike Mark's quick incapacitation, Linda's encounter with the bear became a prolonged struggle that demonstrated both the officer's determination and the animal's persistence. Her radio transmissions during this phase of the attack provided dispatch and later investigators with a real-time account of human versus predator combat that was unprecedented in Alaska law enforcement history. Dispatch: under attack. Mark is down. Send everything. Linda's voice, distorted by stress and the damage to her radio equipment, nevertheless conveyed critical information that would guide the response of incoming units. The struggle between Linda and Bear number 417 moved throughout the cabin's lower level as the officer attempted to use furniture and obstacles to create barriers between herself and the animal. Her tactical training emphasized movement and position, but the confined space limited her options, and the bear's intelligence allowed him to anticipate and counter many of her defensive maneuvers. Linda's service weapon was drawn and fired during the encounter, though the extreme stress and constantly changing positions made accurate shot placement impossible. The sound of gunfire in the confined space was deafening, and the muzzle flashes created a strobe effect that added to the chaos and confusion. At least one round struck the bear, though not in a location that immediately incapacitated the animal. The wound served primarily to further enrage Bear number 417, who now associated the pain with the human he was fighting. The combination of pepper spray effects, gunshot wound, and territorial aggression created a perfect storm of predatory violence that would define the worst wildlife attack in Alaska law enforcement history. Martha Hendricks, trapped upstairs throughout the battle, experienced the horror through sound alone. The crashes, shouts, gunfire, and screams painted an audio picture of violence that her mind struggled to process. Her satellite phone connection to dispatch remained open, providing Sarah McKinnon with a secondary source of information about the ongoing catastrophe. "There's shooting downstairs," Martha reported, her voice hollow with shock. "So much noise, screaming. I think someone is hurt very badly." Sarah's position as dispatch coordinator had become a nightmare of impossible decisions and inadequate resources. She was simultaneously coordinating the response of incoming units, maintaining contact with the trapped civilian, and listening to the radio transmissions from officers who were fighting for their lives 30 miles from the nearest backup. The Alaska State Troopers, alerted during the initial response, had launched multiple units from their Soldotna headquarters, but the distance and road conditions meant that even their fastest response would require another 25 minutes. Alaska Department of Fish and Game Enforcement Officer Dale Thompson was en route with specialized equipment for wildlife emergencies, but his ETA remained unchanged at approximately 45 minutes from the initial call. Most frustratingly, Sarah was receiving offers of assistance from civilian volunteers who had monitored the emergency radio traffic. Local hunters, pilots, and outdoor enthusiasts were volunteering to respond with weapons and equipment that might be more effective than standard police gear. However, departmental policy and liability concerns prevented dispatch from accepting civilian assistance in an active emergency situation. The sounds of combat from inside the cabin gradually diminished as Linda's ability to resist the bear's attacks was overcome by the cumulative damage she had sustained. Her final coherent radio transmission provided dispatch with the information that would guide the investigation and response for the remainder of the emergency. Dispatch. Both officers down. Animal still in cabin. Do not approach. Too dangerous. The transmission ended abruptly, leaving Sarah and the incoming emergency responders with the knowledge that they were now dealing with a double officer down situation, in addition to the original trapped civilian report. Bear number 417's victory over the two law enforcement officers had been achieved at considerable cost to the animal as well. The bear spray exposure had caused significant irritation to his eyes and respiratory system, while the gunshot wound, though not immediately life-threatening, was causing pain and bleeding that affected his movement and behavior. The combination of injuries and chemical exposure began to alter the bear's tactical calculus. The confined space that had worked to his advantage during the attacks was now contaminated with pepper spray residue that made breathing difficult. The scent of gunpowder and blood created an environment that was no longer conducive to extended occupation. Most importantly, the bear's territorial objectives had been achieved. The immediate threats to his claimed space had been neutralized, and the original attractants that had drawn him to the cabin, food, scents, and potential resources, remained accessible for investigation. Bear number 417's decision to withdraw from active combat and resume his exploration of the cabin would provide Martha with a temporary reprieve and give incoming rescue units a narrow window of opportunity to extract the surviving victims. However, the bear's continued presence in and around the cabin meant that any rescue operation would still require extraordinary courage and specialized tactics that exceeded the capabilities of standard emergency response teams. The first responding backup unit to arrive on scene was Alaska State Trooper Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran who had responded to wildlife emergencies throughout his career, but had never encountered anything approaching the scale of carnage that awaited him at the Henderson cabin. Sergeant Rodriguez's arrival at 12:31 p.m., 44 minutes after the initial emergency call, marked the beginning of the rescue phase of the operation. His immediate assessment of the scene: 2 damaged police vehicles with emergency lights still flashing, no sign of the responding officers, and clear evidence of ongoing bear activity around the cabin, told him that the worst-case scenarios were in progress. State Trooper 47 on scene, Rodriguez radioed. No contact with local Units 7 and 12, establishing outer perimeter and requesting immediate backup with specialized wildlife equipment. Rodriguez's vehicle was equipped with a high-powered rifle and expanded first aid supplies that local police units typically didn't carry, but his primary advantage was communication equipment that could coordinate multiple agencies and request additional resources. His first priority was establishing contact with any survivors and determining the current status of the bear. The sight that greeted Rodriguez as he approached the cabin was like a scene from a horror movie. The front and rear doors hung open, revealing dark interior spaces. Equipment was scattered across the snow around both entrances, pieces of police gear, broken radio components, and dark stains that could only be blood. Most ominously, fresh bear tracks led away from the cabin toward the tree line, but then circled back toward the structure, suggesting that the animal was still in the immediate area and continuing to view the cabin as his territory. Rodriguez's attempt to establish radio contact with the missing officers was met with silence. However, his more powerful communication equipment was able to connect with Martha's satellite phone, providing the first direct contact between rescue units and the trapped civilian. "Ma'am, this is Alaska State Trooper Sergeant Rodriguez," he announced, speaking slowly and clearly to penetrate Martha's shock and fear. "I'm here to help you, but I need you to tell me exactly what you can see and hear from your location." Martha's voice was barely recognizable, the trauma of the past hour having reduced her normally articulate speech to fragmented whispers. "The officers, they came to help. There was so much noise and screaming. I think they're hurt. I think they're hurt very badly. Ma'am, I need you to look out your window and tell me if you can see the bear anywhere outside the cabin," Rodriguez continued, using the calm, authoritative tone that was designed to penetrate crisis-induced confusion. Martha's movement to the window required tremendous courage, as it meant exposing herself to potential observation by the animal that had just devastated the police officers below. However, her report provided Rodriguez with critical tactical information. "I can see one of the police cars, but I don't see the officers anywhere," Martha reported. "There's something moving in the trees. It might be the bear, but I can't tell for sure." Rodriguez understood that he was facing a tactical situation unlike any in his experience. The cabin contained at least 2 critically injured law enforcement officers and 1 trapped civilian. but approaching the structure meant potential confrontation with a large bear that had already demonstrated its willingness to attack humans. Standard protocols called for establishing a secure perimeter and waiting for specialized wildlife enforcement, but the medical status of the injured officers might not allow for extended delays. Every minute that passed without medical intervention reduced their chances of survival. Rodriguez's tactical assessment was interrupted by the arrival of the second backup unit. Alaska State Trooper Corporal Lisa Chang, a 12-year veteran who brought additional firepower and medical supplies. The presence of 2 trained officers with appropriate weapons significantly improved the tactical options for approaching the cabin. "Corporal Chang on scene," she radioed. "What's our situation?" Rodriguez quickly briefed his colleague on the known facts. 2 local officers down inside the cabin, 1 civilian trapped upstairs, and a large bear that remained in the immediate area. Their mission was to extract the casualties and civilian while neutralizing the wildlife threat, a combination of objectives that required careful coordination and precise execution. The 2 troopers' tactical discussion was informed by specialized training that local police officers typically didn't receive. Alaska State Troopers regularly dealt with dangerous wildlife encounters, and both Rodriguez and Chang had experience with bear encounters, though nothing approaching the current situation. Their equipment included 30-06 rifles with appropriate ammunition for large bear encounters, advanced first aid supplies, including blood clotting agents and trauma dressings, and communication equipment that could coordinate helicopter evacuation if needed. Most importantly, their vehicles were equipped with public address systems that could be used to attempt bear deterrence without requiring close approach to the cabin. "We're going to try audio deterrence first," Rodriguez decided. "If we can drive the animal away from the structure, we can approach for casualty assessment and extraction." The attempt to use noise and voice commands to drive the bear away from the cabin was based on established wildlife management principles. Most bears, even aggressive ones, would eventually respond to persistent human pressure by withdrawing to less contested territory. However, Bear number 417's behavioral conditioning and territorial claims on the cabin made him far less likely to respond to normal deterrence methods. The animal had invested significant energy in establishing dominance over this location, and the presence of additional humans was viewed as escalated competition rather than a reason to withdraw. The public address system's amplified commands and siren tones did succeed in locating the bear, who emerged from the tree line in response to the new audio stimuli. However, rather than fleeing, the animal moved toward the trooper's position with the confident gait of a predator that had recently established his superiority over human opponents. Rodriguez and Chang found themselves in the surreal situation of facing down a massive brown bear across an open snowfield, while simultaneously trying to coordinate a rescue operation for their fallen colleagues. The bear's approach was deliberate, but not immediately threatening. The animal seemed to be evaluating the new arrivals rather than preparing for immediate attack. "Dispatch, Trooper 47, Rodriguez radioed while maintaining visual contact with the approaching bear. "Animal is moving toward our position. Request immediate ETA on fish and game enforcement with specialized equipment." The response from dispatch coordinated multiple agency resources that were converging on the Crossman Ridge location. Fish and Game Enforcement Officer Dale Thompson was now 15 minutes out with tranquilizer equipment and specialized capture gear. A medical helicopter had been dispatched from Anchorage and would arrive in approximately 25 minutes, weather permitting. Most critically, the Alaska Department of Fish and Game's emergency response team was en route with equipment and personnel specifically trained for dangerous wildlife situations. However, their ETA remained 30 minutes, and the medical status of the injured officers might not allow for that delay. The standoff between the two troopers and bear number 417 continued for several minutes, with the animal maintaining a distance of approximately 100 yards, while clearly evaluating the new threats to his territory. The bear's behavior suggested intelligence and caution rather than immediate aggression, providing a narrow window of opportunity for tactical planning. "We need to get to those officers," Chang observed, studying the cabin and considering approach routes that would minimize exposure to bear attack. "Every minute we wait reduces their chances." Rodriguez understood the medical urgency, but he also recognized that rushing into the situation that had already claimed 2 officers could result in additional casualties that would compound the tragedy rather than resolving it. The tactical solution came from an unexpected source, Martha Hendricks herself. Her satellite phone communication with the troopers revealed that she had a clear view of the cabin's interior from her upstairs position and could potentially provide guidance for any rescue approach. "Ma'am, we need your help," Rodriguez explained to Martha. "Can you see the officers from where you are? Can you tell us their condition?" Martha's report from her elevated position provided the first direct information about Mark and Linda's status since the attacks had ended. Her description was halting and obviously difficult for her to deliver, but it contained the critical information that would determine the rescue approach. "One of them, the one in the back, he's not moving at all," Martha reported, her voice breaking. "The other one, the woman, she's moving a little bit, but there's blood everywhere." The information confirmed Rodriguez's fears. They were dealing with 1 fatality and 1 critically injured officer who required immediate medical intervention. The tactical equation now heavily favored aggressive action despite the continued bear threat. However, Martha's next observation changed everything about the rescue approach. "The bear, it's not downstairs anymore. I can see it through the kitchen window. It's outside on the back porch, just sitting there." The bear's movement outside the cabin created the tactical opportunity that Rodriguez and Chang needed. If the animal remained on the back porch, they could potentially approach through the front entrance and extract the casualties without direct confrontation. The rescue operation that followed would be studied by law enforcement and emergency response agencies throughout Alaska as an example of coordinated tactical response under extreme conditions. However, for the 2 troopers preparing to enter a cabin that reeked of blood and pepper spray, it was simply a matter of attempting to save their colleagues' lives while avoiding the mistakes that had cost Mark Jensen his life. Rodriguez and Chang's approach to the cabin was methodical and coordinated, with each officer covering specific sectors of fire while maintaining communication with dispatch and the trapped civilian upstairs. Their tactical movement was complicated by the snow conditions and the need to avoid startling the bear into renewed aggressive behavior. The interior of the Henderson cabin, when the troopers finally gained entry, was a scene of destruction that exceeded even their worst expectations. Furniture was overturned and smashed, the kitchen had been completely demolished, and blood evidence throughout the lower level told the story of 2 separate combat zones where human officers had fought desperately against an enemy that exceeded all their training and equipment. Mark Jensen's body was located in the kitchen area, and Rodriguez's immediate assessment confirmed that the veteran officer had sustained injuries that were incompatible with life. The bear's attack had been swift and devastating, targeting vital areas with the precision of a natural predator. Linda Flores was discovered in the living room area, conscious but critically injured and requiring immediate medical intervention. Her survival of the bear encounter was miraculous, but her injuries were severe enough that every minute of delay increased the risk of permanent disability or death. "Dispatch, Trooper 47, Rodriguez radioed while Chang began immediate first aid on the injured officer. "Confirming 1 officer fatality, 1 officer critical. Initiating emergency medical procedures. Request immediate helicopter evacuation and trauma team activation." The medical response that followed drew resources from across south-central Alaska. South Peninsula Hospital activated its trauma team and prepared for helicopter transport of a critical patient, while emergency medical personnel from multiple agencies converged on the remote cabin location. However, the bear's continued presence in the immediate area meant that helicopter evacuation would be impossible until the animal was either captured or neutralized. Bear number 417's territorial claims on the cabin extended to the airspace above it, and the sound of approaching helicopters would likely trigger renewed aggressive behavior. Fish and Game Enforcement Officer Dale Thompson's arrival on scene at 1:15 p.m. brought specialized equipment and expertise specifically designed for dangerous wildlife encounters. Thompson's 25 years of experience with bear management throughout Alaska made him the tactical leader for the wildlife portion of the emergency response. Thompson's immediate assessment of bear number 417's behavior and positioning led him to conclude that tranquilization would be extremely difficult given the animal's current stress level and defensive positioning. The bear's exposure to pepper spray and gunshot wound had made him hypervigilant and reactive to any human approach. "This animal is not going to go down easy," Thompson advised the assembled emergency responders. "He's been through combat, he's wounded, and he considers this his territory. Tranquilization is possible, but it's going to require multiple darts and perfect timing." The alternative to tranquilization was lethal force, a decision that required authorization from multiple agencies and consideration of both public safety and wildlife management policies. However, with a critically injured officer requiring immediate helicopter evacuation, the tactical situation was rapidly moving toward a conclusion that would end bear number 417's reign of terror. The medical helicopter's arrival overhead at 1:28 p.m. forced the final tactical decision. The aircraft's presence immediately triggered aggressive behavior from the bear, who emerged from his position behind the cabin and began displaying the territorial posturing that had preceded his attacks on the police officers. Thompson's decision to deploy lethal force was based on immediate threat assessment and the inability to guarantee public safety through any other means. His shot placement, guided by decades of experience with Alaska's largest predators, was precise and effective. Bear number 417's rampage ended 1,200 yards from where it had begun, bringing closure to the most violent wildlife encounter in modern Alaska law enforcement history. The helicopter evacuation of Linda Flores proceeded without further incident, though her injuries would require multiple surgeries and months of rehabilitation. Her survival of the bear encounter would later be attributed to a combination of tactical training, physical fitness, and extraordinary determination. But the psychological impacts of the experience would affect her for the rest of her life. Martha Hendricks' extraction from the cabin's upper level was accomplished by ladder truck personnel from the Homer Fire Department, who arrived as part of the expanded emergency response. Her physical injuries were minimal, but the psychological trauma of listening to the attacks from her position of helplessness would require extensive counseling and support. The investigation phase of the incident began even before all the victims had been evacuated from the scene. Alaska Department of Fish and Game biologists, Alaska State Troopers, and federal wildlife enforcement personnel began the complex process of documenting and analyzing every aspect of the encounter. The necropsy performed on bear number 417 revealed important information about the factors that had contributed to the attack. The animal was found to be in poor physical condition due to the disrupted hibernation cycle, with body fat reserves depleted to levels that would have threatened survival. Stomach contents analysis confirmed that the bear had not eaten for several days prior to the attack, explaining the desperate food-seeking behavior that had led him to Martha's cabin. Most significantly, the necropsy revealed evidence of previous human food conditioning that had taught the bear to associate human activities with potential food sources. Trail camera footage from research stations throughout the area confirmed that bear number 417 had been systematically investigating human structures throughout the winter, leading inevitably to the confrontation that claimed Mark Jensen's life. The forensic reconstruction of the attack sequence provided law enforcement agencies with unprecedented detail about the dynamics of human-bear combat. The analysis revealed that both officers had followed proper protocols given their equipment and training, but that standard police procedures were simply inadequate for dealing with a large, aggressive bear in confined quarters. Mark Jensen's funeral drew hundreds of mourners from throughout Alaska, including law enforcement officers, military personnel, and community members who had been touched by his service. The ceremony emphasized his dual role as protector of his community and devoted family man, while acknowledging the ultimate sacrifice he had made in attempting to save a stranger's life. The Homer Police Department's response to the loss of one of their officers included both immediate support for affected personnel and long-term policy changes designed to prevent similar tragedies. New protocols for wildlife encounters were developed in cooperation with fish and game enforcement, including specialized training and equipment for all officers. Linda Flores's recovery process extended over 18 months and included multiple surgeries to repair the damage inflicted by bear number 417's attack. Her return to active duty was celebrated throughout the Alaska law enforcement community as a triumph of human resilience and professional dedication. However, her experiences during the attack led to her eventual specialization in emergency response and tactical training, where her hard-won expertise could benefit other officers facing similar challenges. The psychological impact of the incident extended far beyond the immediate participants. Emergency dispatcher Sarah McKinnon required counseling to deal with the trauma of coordinating a response to the deaths and injuries of personnel she knew personally. Her detailed call logs and professional performance during the emergency were later recognized as exemplary, but the emotional cost of listening to colleagues fight for their lives remained with her permanently. Martha Hendricks sold the Crossman Ridge cabin 6 months after the attack and relocated to a senior living community in Anchorage. Her recovery included extensive therapy to address post-traumatic stress symptoms, but she remained grateful for the sacrifice made by the officers who had responded to her emergency call. Her advocacy for improved wildlife safety education became a lasting legacy of the tragic encounter. The broader Alaska community's response to the incident included renewed attention to bear safety education and habitat management policies. The disruption of normal hibernation patterns due to climate change was identified as a contributing factor that required ongoing monitoring and research. Dr. Michael Thornton's research into bear behavior patterns was expanded following the attack, with additional funding provided for studies into food conditioning and human-wildlife conflict. His team's recommendations for property management in bear country were adopted by multiple municipalities throughout Alaska. The legislative response to the attack included hearings on wildlife management policies and emergency response procedures for remote areas. However, the fundamental challenge of human activity in prime wildlife habitat remained unchanged, ensuring that similar conflicts would continue to occur throughout Alaska's wilderness areas. The media coverage of the incident brought national attention to the challenges faced by law enforcement officers in Alaska's remote communities. The heroism displayed by Mark Jensen and Linda Flores was recognized with multiple awards and commendations, while their professional response under impossible circumstances was studied by law enforcement agencies throughout the United States. The insurance and legal proceedings following the attack were complex and prolonged, involving multiple agencies, insurance carriers, and legal jurisdictions. The workers' compensation claims for both officers' families required extensive documentation and advocacy, while liability questions related to property management and wildlife attractants remained unresolved for years. The long-term impact of the incident on Homer's tourism industry was initially significant, as potential visitors expressed concerns about wildlife safety. However, the community's response emphasized proper education and precautions rather than avoidance, leading to enhanced safety programs that actually improved the visitor experience. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game's policy review following the attack led to changes in bear management protocols, including more aggressive intervention for food-conditioned animals and enhanced monitoring of bears that remained active during winter months. The agency's cooperation with law enforcement was formalized through joint training programs and shared communication systems. The scientific analysis of bear number 417's behavior patterns contributed to research into climate change impacts on wildlife behavior throughout the Arctic. The bear's disrupted hibernation cycle was documented as part of a broader pattern affecting multiple species across Alaska and northern Canada. The technological improvements implemented following the attack included enhanced communication systems for remote area emergency response and specialized equipment designed specifically for wildlife encounters. GPS tracking systems for emergency responders were expanded to ensure that backup units could locate and assist colleagues more effectively. The training programs developed in response to the incident became models for other agencies dealing with wildlife encounters in remote areas. The combination of tactical response, medical support, and specialized wildlife knowledge was recognized as essential for effective emergency response in Alaska's challenging environment. The memorial established for Mark Jensen at the Homer Police Department serves as a permanent reminder of the risks faced by law enforcement officers in Alaska's remote communities. The memorial emphasizes his commitment to protecting others and his willingness to sacrifice his own safety for the welfare of strangers. Linda Flores's continued service with the Homer Police Department demonstrated the resilience and dedication that characterized Alaska law enforcement personnel. Her expertise in emergency response, gained through personal experience with life and death situations, became invaluable in training other officers and improving departmental procedures. The community support systems that developed following the attack included enhanced counseling services for emergency responders and their families. The recognition that traumatic incidents affected not only direct participants, but also their support networks, led to comprehensive assistance programs that served as models for other agencies. The research conducted into the incident's causes and consequences contributed to academic understanding of human-wildlife conflict in changing climatic conditions. University studies examining the intersection of climate change, wildlife behavior, and human safety drew extensively on the documentation and analysis of the Henderson cabin attack. The policy recommendations that emerged from the investigation emphasized the importance of proactive wildlife management rather than reactive responses to dangerous situations. Early intervention with food-conditioned bears was identified as crucial for preventing the escalation of conflicts to violent encounters. The international attention focused on the incident led to comparative studies of wildlife encounter protocols in other countries facing similar challenges. Canada, Scandinavia, and Russia all examined their emergency response procedures in light of the lessons learned from the Alaska attack. The technological innovations developed for bear encounter response included improved chemical deterrents, enhanced protective equipment, and communication systems designed for use in extreme conditions. These innovations benefited not only law enforcement, but also researchers, outdoor enthusiasts, and residents of remote areas throughout Bear Country. The educational programs implemented following the attack reached thousands of Alaska residents and visitors, providing practical information about bear safety, property management, and emergency response. The programs emphasized personal responsibility and community cooperation in reducing human-wildlife conflicts. The ongoing monitoring of the Crossman Ridge area revealed important information about how wildlife populations respond to traumatic events involving human contact. The temporary reduction in bear activity following the incident provided researchers with insights into animal behavior and territory management. The legal precedents established through the investigation and subsequent proceedings clarified responsibilities and procedures for emergency response in wildlife encounter situations. The court decisions provided guidance for future cases involving similar circumstances and contributed to the development of standardized protocols. The family support systems established for Mark Jensen's survivors became permanent programs that provided assistance to the families of other fallen officers. The recognition that law enforcement fatalities affected entire families and communities led to comprehensive support programs that addressed financial, emotional, and practical needs. The interagency cooperation that developed during the emergency response became a model for coordinated action in complex situations involving multiple jurisdictions and specialized expertise. The communication protocols and command structure implemented during the crisis were adopted as standard procedures for similar incidents. The public safety improvements that resulted from the incident included enhanced warning systems for wildlife activity, improved emergency communication capabilities, and expanded training for civilian residents of remote areas. These improvements contributed to a reduction in dangerous wildlife encounters throughout the region. The environmental management policies that were re-evaluated following the attack addressed the complex relationship between human development and wildlife habitat preservation. The balance between providing access to Alaska's wilderness and maintaining public safety required ongoing adjustment and refinement. The professional development opportunities that emerged from the incident included specialized training programs, certification courses, and career advancement paths for emergency responders dealing with wildlife encounters. These programs ensured that the knowledge gained through tragedy would be used to improve future responses and prevent similar losses. The cultural impact of the incident on Alaska's law enforcement community included a renewed appreciation for the unique challenges faced by officers in remote areas and recognition of the extraordinary courage required for routine duties in dangerous environments. The incident became part of the shared history and tradition of Alaska law enforcement. The research partnerships that developed between law enforcement agencies and academic institutions led to ongoing studies of emergency response effectiveness, wildlife behavior, and human psychology under extreme stress. These partnerships ensured that practical experience was combined with scientific analysis to improve understanding and procedures. The equipment innovations that resulted from analyzing the attack included improvements to protective gear, weapons systems, and emergency medical supplies specifically designed for wildlife encounter scenarios. These innovations were adopted by agencies throughout North America and contributed to improved officer safety. The public policy discussions that followed the incident addressed fundamental questions about human activity in wildlife habitat and the responsibilities of government agencies to protect both public safety and environmental integrity. These discussions contributed to policy development at local, state, and federal levels. The international cooperation that emerged from sharing information about the incident led to collaborative research projects and information exchange programs with other countries facing similar wildlife management challenges. The global perspective, enhanced understanding of human-wildlife conflict, and improved response strategies. The long-term monitoring programs established to track wildlife behavior patterns in the aftermath of the incident provided valuable data about ecosystem recovery and adaptation. The information gathered contributed to broader understanding of environmental change and its impacts on wildlife populations. The January 8, 2025 bear attack at the Henderson Cabin remains the most extensively documented wildlife encounter in Alaska law enforcement history. The combination of detailed emergency communications, multiple witness accounts, forensic evidence, and comprehensive investigation created an unprecedented record of human-wildlife conflict under extreme conditions. The lessons learned from the tragedy continue to influence emergency response procedures, wildlife management policies, and law enforcement training throughout Alaska and beyond. The sacrifice made by Officer Mark Jensen and the courage demonstrated by Officer Linda Flores serve as permanent reminders of the dedication and heroism required for public service in America's last frontier. The incident stands as a testament to both the magnificent power of Alaska's wildlife and the extraordinary bravery of those who risk their lives to protect others in one of the world's most challenging environments. In the end, the story of January 8, 2025 is not just about a bear attack, but about human courage, sacrifice, and the eternal struggle between civilization and the untamed wilderness that defines Alaska's character and spirit. The next story is November 4th, 2024. Polar bear attacks oil workers. 2 dead in 7 minutes. The Arctic wind howled across the Beaufort Sea with a ferocity that seemed to penetrate straight through the reinforced walls of the North Star drilling platform's temporary onshore facility. Located approximately 47 miles northeast of Utqiagvik, formerly known as Barrow, Alaska, the remote drilling site represented one of the most isolated industrial operations in North America. The nearest permanent settlement lay nearly 2 hours away by helicopter in good weather, and on this particular November morning, the weather was anything but good. Dr. Sarah Chen, a wildlife biologist with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, would later describe the location as a perfect storm of environmental factors that created an inevitable collision between human industrial activity and one of the Arctic's most formidable predators. The drilling site sat on a narrow strip of land between the frozen Beaufort Sea and a series of inland lagoons that served as critical habitat for ringed seals, the primary prey species for the region's polar bear population. The facility itself consisted of a cluster of prefabricated buildings arranged in a rough, hexagonal pattern around the central drilling tower. The main camp housed 43 workers during the peak operational period, with accommodations ranging from the cramped but functional sleeping quarters to the surprisingly well-appointed dining facility that served as the social heart of the operation. Security protocols, established by Trans-Arctic Petroleum Solutions in consultation with federal wildlife authorities, included a perimeter fence designed more to keep curious wildlife at bay than to provide any real defense against a determined predator, motion-activated floodlights, and a requirement that no worker venture outside the designated safe zones without radio contact and bear spray. Carlos Alejandro Mendoza arrived at the drilling site on October 28, 2024, 6 days before the attack that would claim his life. At 29 years old, Carlos represented the new generation of oilfield workers, educated and environmentally conscious, yet drawn to the lucrative opportunities of Arctic extraction. Born in Laredo, Texas, to Elena and Miguel Mendoza, Carlos had earned a degree in petroleum engineering from the University of Texas before spending 5 years working rigs in the Permian Basin. His decision to take a position with Transarctic came after his girlfriend, Maria Santos, announced her pregnancy, and the substantial compensation package offered for Arctic work would allow them to purchase their first home. Standing 5 feet 10 inches tall, with the lean build of someone who had spent years climbing derricks and maneuvering in tight spaces, Carlos possessed an easy smile and an infectious enthusiasm for his work that had quickly endeared him to his fellow crew members. His supervisor, James Big Jim Morrison, a 22-year veteran of oil field operations, had noted in his personnel files that Carlos demonstrated exceptional spatial awareness and an intuitive understanding of drilling dynamics that suggested significant advancement potential. During his first 5 days at the site, Carlos had thrown himself into learning the unique challenges of Arctic drilling. The permafrost presented complications unknown in warmer climates, requiring specialized equipment and techniques to prevent environmental damage while maintaining operational efficiency. He spent hours studying the geological surveys that revealed the complex subsurface structure beneath the site, where ancient ice formations created pockets of instability that demanded careful navigation during the drilling process. Ethan David Lowe, 33 years old and originally from Anchorage, served as the site's lead equipment operator, responsible for maintaining the complex array of machinery that kept the drilling operation functional in temperatures that regularly dropped below -30 degrees Fahrenheit. Unlike Carlos, who was relatively new to Arctic work, Ethan had spent the better part of a decade working various sites across Alaska's North Slope. His weathered face and prematurely gray hair spoke to years of exposure to the harsh Arctic environment, while his methodical approach to equipment maintenance had earned him a reputation as one of the most reliable operators in the region. Ethan's path to the Arctic had been shaped by personal tragedy. Following his divorce from Jennifer Lowe in 2019, which had resulted from his prolonged absences and the strain of isolation work, Ethan had deliberately sought out the most remote postings available. His ex-wife had retained custody of their 8-year-old daughter, Chloe, and Ethan's quarterly visits to Anchorage represented the only times he ventured back to civilization for more than supply runs or medical emergencies. The irony, which Ethan's friends often pointed out, was that his self-imposed exile had made him more introspective and emotionally available than he had ever been during his marriage. His letters to Chloe, written in the evenings after his shifts, revealed a thoughtful and caring father who struggled with the balance between providing for his daughter's future and being present for her childhood. In one letter, discovered among his personal effects after the attack, Ethan had written, "Sometimes I think about the bears we see out here and how they travel hundreds of miles across the ice just to find food for their cubs. I guess I'm not so different, except my ice is made of loneliness instead of water." The rest of the crew represented a cross-section of individuals drawn to Arctic work by various circumstances and motivations. Marcus Thompson, a 45-year-old former Army engineer from Detroit, served as the site's safety coordinator, bringing military precision to civilian industrial operations. His background included tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, where he had developed expertise in establishing secure perimeters in hostile environments. The protocols he had implemented at the drilling site reflected this military mindset, with scheduled perimeter checks, mandatory buddy system protocols for outdoor work, and detailed emergency response procedures. Rebecca Walsh, 38 years old and one of only 3 women at the site, worked as a geologist specializing in permafrost analysis. Her research had contributed to several groundbreaking studies on climate change impacts in the Arctic, and her presence at the drilling site represented a compromise between her environmental concerns and the practical need to monitor industrial activities in sensitive ecosystems. Rebecca's daily logs, meticulously maintained throughout her time at the site, would later provide crucial timeline information for investigators attempting to reconstruct the events leading up to the attack. Dr. Michael Harrison, the site's chief engineer and project director, carried the ultimate responsibility for both operational success and crew safety. At 51 years old, Dr. Harrison had overseen drilling operations on 4 continents, but the North Star project represented his first extended Arctic deployment. His initial confidence in the site's security protocols would be forever shattered by the events of November 4th, and the guilt he carried afterward would eventually force his early retirement from the industry. The crew's daily routine had been established through a combination of operational necessity and environmental adaptation. Wake-up calls came at 5:30 a.m., with the first shift beginning at 6 a.m. sharp. The drilling operation ran continuously, with 3 8-hour shifts ensuring round-the-clock progress. Meals were served at precisely scheduled times to maintain crew cohesion and morale, with the evening meal period from 6 to 8 p.m. serving as the primary social time for the entire crew. October 29, 2024, marked Carlos's second day of active drilling operations. The morning began with temperatures of -22 degrees Fahrenheit and winds gusting up to 35 miles per hour from the northeast. Despite the challenging conditions, the crew maintained their normal routine, with Carlos assigned to the day shift under the direct supervision of Ethan Lowe. The relationship between the two men had developed quickly, built on Carlos's eagerness to learn and Ethan's patient teaching style. During the lunch break that day, Rebecca Walsh made the first documented observation of polar bear tracks near the facility perimeter. Her field notes, recorded at 12:47 p.m., described large 4-toed prints with claw marks extending approximately 2 inches beyond the pad impressions, consistent with an adult polar bear of substantial size. The tracks appeared to follow the fence line for approximately 50 yards before veering toward the sea ice, suggesting the animal had been investigating the facility but had ultimately continued on its natural patrol route. Marcus Thompson conducted the mandatory perimeter inspection at 2:15 p.m. and confirmed Rebecca's observations. His security log noted that the tracks appeared fresh, probably made within the previous 12 hours, and that the bear had approached to within 15 feet of the main generator building before changing direction. Following established protocols, Marcus immediately radioed Dr. Harrison and initiated enhanced security measures, including additional perimeter checks every 2 hours and a temporary restriction on solo outdoor activities. The enhanced security protocols remained in effect for the following 48 hours, during which time no additional bear sign was observed. However, retrospective analysis of the site's motion-activated camera system revealed that a polar bear, almost certainly the same individual that had left the tracks, had returned to the area on at least 3 separate occasions between October 30th and November 2nd. The bear's behavior during these visits showed a pattern of increasing familiarity with the facility, progressing from cautious perimeter surveillance to bold approaches that brought the animal within 10 feet of occupied buildings. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a polar bear specialist with the U.S. Geological Survey who was called in to analyze the camera footage after the attack, identified several concerning behavioral indicators in the bear's approach patterns. This individual displayed classic characteristics of a bear that was actively evaluating human activity as a potential resource opportunity, Dr. Rodriguez explained in her official report. The systematic nature of its reconnaissance, combined with the decreasing flight distances observed in successive visits, suggested an animal that was rapidly losing its natural fear of humans. The bear captured in the security footage appeared to be a large adult male, estimated at between 8 and 10 feet in length and potentially weighing over 1,200 pounds. Polar bears of this size represent apex predators perfectly adapted to Arctic survival, capable of detecting prey from miles away and possessing the strength to break through sea ice several feet thick. During the months leading up to November, climate data indicated that sea ice formation had been delayed by nearly 3 weeks compared to historical averages, potentially limiting the bear's access to its primary hunting grounds and increasing the likelihood of opportunistic behavior near human settlements. November 1st, 2024, brought the first significant snowfall of the season, with accumulations reaching 18 inches by morning. The storm system responsible for the snowfall also brought dropping temperatures and sustained winds that created whiteout conditions, lasting through the early afternoon. Drilling operations continued with reduced outdoor activity, and the crews settled into the familiar rhythm of storm-induced isolation that characterized Arctic industrial work. During the afternoon of November 1st, Carlos wrote what would be his final letter to Maria Santos. In the letter, discovered among his personal belongings, Carlos described his growing appreciation for the Arctic environment and his increasing confidence in his ability to handle the unique challenges of polar drilling. "The landscape here changes every day," he wrote. "Sometimes it's so beautiful it takes your breath away, and sometimes it's so harsh you wonder how anything survives. But there's something pure about it, something that makes you feel very small and very connected to the world at the same time." The letter also revealed Carlos's growing friendship with Ethan Lowe and his admiration for the older man's expertise and patience. "Ethan has been teaching me not just the technical aspects of Arctic drilling, but how to read the environment, how to anticipate problems before they develop. He says the Arctic doesn't forgive carelessness, but it rewards preparation and respect. I'm starting to understand what he means." November 2nd and 3rd passed without significant incident, with the crew gradually returning to normal operations as weather conditions improved. The drilling had progressed ahead of schedule, and Dr. Harrison's daily reports to the Home Office reflected his satisfaction with both the technical progress and the crew's adaptation to Arctic conditions. In hindsight, this period of routine success may have contributed to a gradual relaxation of the heightened security measures that had been implemented following the initial bear track discovery. The evening of November 3rd featured the week's scheduled recreation period, during which crew members gathered in the dining facility for an evening of card games, movie watching, and general socialization. Carlos and Ethan were observed playing chess, a game that Ethan had been teaching Carlos during their off-duty hours. Rebecca Walsh's personal journal entry for that evening noted the positive morale throughout the crew and her own sense of accomplishment as the geological surveys neared completion. Marcus Thompson conducted his final perimeter check of November 3rd at 10:15 p.m., finding no evidence of wildlife activity and noting that the overnight security lighting was functioning properly. The temperature had stabilized at -18 degrees Fahrenheit with light winds from the southwest. His security log for the evening concluded with the notation, "All clear, normal Arctic conditions, crew secure for the night." November 4th, 2024 began like any other day at the drilling site. The 5:30 a.m. wake-up call echoed through the sleeping quarters, followed by the familiar sounds of 30-plus people beginning their daily routines in the confined space of the Arctic facility. Carlos Mendoza was among the first to rise, a habit he had developed during his years of oil field work, believing that starting early gave him a psychological advantage in facing the day's challenges. The morning temperature read -24 degrees Fahrenheit, colder than the previous several days, but well within the normal operating range for the site. Wind speeds were relatively calm at 15 to 20 miles per hour from the northwest, and visibility was excellent under clear skies that revealed the aurora borealis still faintly visible in the pre-dawn darkness. Ethan Lowe arrived at the dining facility at 5:45 a.m., to find Carlos already seated with his morning coffee and a plate of scrambled eggs and toast. The two men had fallen into the habit of sharing breakfast and using the time to discuss the day's planned activities and any technical challenges they anticipated. On this particular morning, their conversation focused on a recurring issue with the drilling fluid circulation system that had been causing minor delays in the operation. "I've been thinking about that pressure drop we saw yesterday," Carlos said, referring to a subtle but persistent anomaly in the drilling system's hydraulic readings. "What if the problem isn't with the pumps themselves, but with ice crystal formation in the return lines?" Ethan nodded thoughtfully, impressed once again by Carlos's analytical approach to problem solving. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that separates good drillers from great ones," he replied. "Ice formation is always a concern up here, but it's not always obvious where it's happening or how severe it needs to get before it affects operations." Their conversation was interrupted by Rebecca Walsh, who joined them at their table carrying a tablet displaying weather forecast data. "We've got another storm system moving in from the northwest," she announced. "Current projections show it arriving sometime around midday, with potential for significant snow accumulation and high winds through the evening." Dr. Harrison, overhearing the weather discussion from a nearby table, approached to review the forecast details. As project director, weather-related decisions fell within his ultimate authority, and the approaching storm required careful consideration of whether to maintain normal operations or implement storm protocols that would temporarily halt drilling activities. "How confident are we in the timing?" Dr. Harrison asked, studying the meteorological data on Rebecca's tablet. "If this system moves faster than predicted, we could find ourselves caught in deteriorating conditions with equipment exposed." Rebecca's experience with Arctic weather patterns had taught her to err on the side of caution when dealing with storm forecasts in the region. "The models are showing good agreement on the general track and intensity, but the timing could easily vary by plus or minus 3 hours, she explained. "My recommendation would be to plan for the early arrival scenario and be pleasantly surprised if we get additional preparation time." Dr. Harrison's decision to maintain normal operations for the morning shift while preparing for potential storm-related shutdown by early afternoon reflected the delicate balance that characterized Arctic industrial operations. Shutting down too early resulted in lost productivity and increased operational costs, while waiting too long risked equipment damage and crew safety. His choice, which seemed reasonable given the available information, would later be scrutinized by investigators seeking to understand whether alternative decisions might have prevented the tragedy that followed. The 6 a.m. shift change proceeded according to the established routine, with the night crew providing detailed handoffs to their day shift replacements. Carlos and Ethan assumed their positions at the drilling control station, where banks of monitors displayed real-time data on drilling depth, pressure readings, fluid circulation rates, and dozens of other parameters that required constant monitoring and adjustment. Marcus Thompson began his morning security routine at 6:15 a.m., conducting the first of 4 scheduled perimeter inspections that would occur throughout the day shift. His inspection route followed a predetermined path that took him around the entire facility perimeter, checking fence integrity, examining the area around each building for any signs of wildlife activity, and verifying the proper functioning of motion-activated lighting and alarm systems. Thompson's inspection on the morning of November 4th revealed no immediate concerns, but his trained eye noticed subtle signs that would later take on enormous significance. Near the northeast corner of the dining facility, he observed what appeared to be compressed snow in a pattern suggesting that a large animal had been lying down for an extended period. The depression was approximately 8 feet long and 3 feet wide, consistent with an adult polar bear resting position. More troubling were the tracks leading to and from the resting site. Unlike the previous bear tracks that had been observed moving along the perimeter and then away from the facility, these tracks showed a pattern of approach, extended observation, and departure that suggested the bear had spent considerable time studying the human activity within the compound. The tracks were also notably fresh, with sharp edges and no evidence of wind erosion, indicating they had been made within the previous 6 to 8 hours. Thompson immediately radioed his findings to Dr. Harrison, who authorized an immediate implementation of enhanced security protocols. All outdoor activities were suspended pending a comprehensive evaluation of the situation, and crew members were instructed to remain within designated safe areas until further notice. The drilling operation continued, but with additional personnel assigned to monitoring duties and enhanced communication procedures. Dr. Harrison's decision to contact Alaska Department of Fish and Game Wildlife authorities reflected both his concern about the escalating bear activity and his recognition that the situation had moved beyond the scope of standard industrial security measures. The initial contact, placed at 7:23 a.m., connected him with Wildlife Officer Jennifer Martinez, a specialist in human-wildlife conflict resolution with extensive experience in Arctic bear encounters. Officer Martinez's assessment of the situation, based on Thompson's description of the bear behavior, immediately elevated the incident to high-priority status. "What you're describing sounds like a bear that has moved beyond casual curiosity into active surveillance mode," she explained to Dr. Harrison during their phone conversation. This kind of prolonged observation behavior often precedes more aggressive investigative actions. The distance between the Wildlife Authority's Utqiagvik office and the drilling site meant that the earliest possible arrival time for a wildlife response team would be approximately 3 hours, assuming favorable weather conditions and immediate helicopter availability. Officer Martinez advised Dr. Harrison to maintain the enhanced security posture and avoid any activities that might attract additional bear attention, such as food preparation or waste disposal outside the facility. At 8 a.m., Carlos and Ethan were deep in the process of adjusting drilling parameters to compensate for the hydraulic pressure anomaly they had discussed during breakfast. The technical challenge required careful coordination between multiple systems, and both men were fully focused on their respective responsibilities. Carlos monitored the drilling fluid circulation, while Ethan made precise adjustments to the drilling motor's rotational speed and downward pressure. The work represented the kind of complex problem-solving that had drawn both men to the oil industry, requiring a combination of technical knowledge, practical experience, and intuitive understanding of mechanical systems operating under extreme conditions. Their collaboration had developed into an efficient partnership, with each man anticipating the other's actions and communications reduced to essential information exchange. At 8:47 a.m., Rebecca Walsh was conducting soil temperature measurements approximately 50 yards from the main drilling tower when she observed movement along the northern perimeter of the facility. Her initial assumption was that she was seeing one of the crew members conducting security rounds, but closer observation revealed the distinctive profile of a polar bear moving parallel to the fence line. Rebecca's immediate radio call to Marcus Thompson initiated the facility's Bear Alert protocol, which required all outdoor personnel to immediately return to designated safe areas and all crew members to maintain constant radio contact. Rebecca's position, while not immediately dangerous, required her to traverse approximately 30 yards of open ground to reach the nearest building entrance, a distance she covered in what she later described as the longest 45 seconds of my life. The bear, Rebecca observed, was moving with the purposeful gait characteristic of an animal actively hunting or investigating a potential food source. Its behavior showed none of the casual wandering typical of bears simply passing through an area. instead displaying the focused attention of a predator evaluating its options. Most concerning was the animal's lack of apparent fear or caution regarding the human activity and industrial noise that should have deterred a wild bear from approaching so closely. Marcus Thompson's response to Rebecca's bear alert involved immediate implementation of the facility's wildlife encounter protocols, including activation of the site's emergency alarm system and radio contact with all crew members to confirm their locations and safety status. His subsequent visual confirmation of the bear's presence elevated the situation to the highest level of alert, requiring immediate contact with both Dr. Harrison and external wildlife authorities. The bear Thompson observed through binoculars from the safety of the security office appeared to be an exceptionally large adult male, moving with the confident swagger that characterizes dominant polar bears in their prime. The animal's coat appeared thick and healthy, suggesting good nutritional status, which initially seemed to contradict the theory that hunger was driving its interest in the human facility. However, polar bear specialists would later explain that well-fed bears are often more likely to engage in bold investigative behavior, as they possess the energy and confidence to explore novel situations without the desperation that characterizes starving animals. At 9:15 a.m., Dr. Harrison made the decision to temporarily halt drilling operations and recall all personnel to the main buildings. This decision reflected his growing concern about the bear's persistent presence and the advice he had received from wildlife authorities regarding the importance of minimizing human activity that might attract further bear attention. The shutdown procedure required careful coordination to ensure that drilling equipment was properly secured and that the well bore remained stable during the interruption. Carlos and Ethan's reaction to the drilling shutdown order reflected their different levels of experience with Arctic wildlife encounters. Ethan, having worked multiple sites across Alaska's North Slope, had encountered polar bears on several previous occasions and understood both the serious nature of the threat and the importance of following established safety protocols. Carlos, for whom this represented his first direct encounter with Arctic megafauna, struggled to reconcile his intellectual understanding of polar bear capabilities with the practical reality of being essentially trapped within the confines of the facility. "How long do these situations typically last?" Carlos asked Ethan as they completed the drilling shutdown sequence. "Are we talking about hours, or could this stretch into days?" Ethan's response reflected both his practical experience and his awareness that each bear encounter was unique and potentially unpredictable. "It really depends on what the bear is looking for and whether it finds what it wants," he explained. "Sometimes they'll investigate for a few hours and then move on. Sometimes they'll hang around for days, especially if they've found something that interests them." The technical challenge of maintaining drilling equipment in standby mode during extended periods of Arctic cold added another layer of complexity to the situation. Many of the systems required continuous operation to prevent freezing and damage, while others needed to be fully shut down to conserve fuel and reduce the noise and activity that might attract additional bear attention. Carlos and Ethan spent the following hour working through these competing requirements, ensuring that critical systems remained operational while minimizing the facility's overall activity profile. At 10:30 a.m., the bear's behavior shifted from passive observation to active investigation of the facility perimeter. Thompson's security cameras captured footage of the animal approaching the main gate area and using its powerful claws to manipulate the fence structure, apparently testing its strength and stability. The bear's actions demonstrated a level of problem-solving intelligence that surprised even experienced wildlife personnel who later reviewed the footage. Dr. Elena Rodriguez's subsequent analysis of the bear's behavior during this period identified several indicators that should have been recognized as precursors to more aggressive action. The systematic testing of barriers, combined with the prolonged observation period, created a behavioral profile consistent with a bear that was actively planning rather than simply exploring, Dr. Rodriguez explained in her official report. This level of cognitive engagement with human-made structures represents highly sophisticated predatory behavior. The bear's investigation of the perimeter fence revealed several potential vulnerabilities in the facility's security design. While the fence was adequate for deterring casual wildlife encounters, it was not designed to withstand the determined attention of a 1,200-pound predator equipped with 4-inch claws and powerful jaw muscles capable of crushing seal skulls with ease. The chain-link construction, while topped with barbed wire, offered numerous grip points that a sufficiently motivated bear could exploit to gain entry to the compound. At 11 a.m., Dr. Harrison received confirmation that the Wildlife Response Team was en route from Utqiagvik, with an estimated arrival time of 12:15 p.m., assuming continued favorable weather conditions. The team consisted of Officer Jennifer Martinez and 2 additional wildlife specialists equipped with tranquilizer guns, bear deterrent devices, and emergency medical supplies. Their helicopter also carried equipment for establishing a temporary exclusion zone around the facility if the situation required extended bear management activities. The news of the wildlife team's impending arrival provided some reassurance to the facility crew, but also highlighted the reality that they remained vulnerable for at least another hour and 15 minutes. Dr. Harrison's decision to maintain the current alert status while beginning preliminary preparations for normal operations resumption reflected his balancing of immediate safety concerns with operational requirements. Carlos spent the morning downtime studying Arctic wildlife management protocols in the facility's Emergency Procedures Manual, a document he had reviewed during his initial orientation but had not previously considered in practical terms. The manual's descriptions of polar bear behavior and recommended response procedures took on new significance as he observed the actual animal through the dining facility's reinforced windows. It's incredible how different it looks in person compared to zoo bears or nature documentaries, Carlos commented to Ethan as they watched the bear continue its perimeter investigation. There's something about the way it moves that makes it seem almost supernatural. Ethan's response reflected his deeper understanding of Arctic ecology and the role that polar bears played in the region's natural systems. They're perfectly adapted machines for surviving in one of the harshest environments on Earth, he explained. Everything about them, from their black skin under white fur to their ability to smell seals through 3 feet of ice, represents millions of years of evolutionary refinement. At 11:45 a.m., the approaching storm system began to affect local weather conditions, with increasing winds and dropping visibility as snow began to fall. The deteriorating weather raised concerns about the Wildlife Response Team's ability to reach the facility on schedule, and Dr. Harrison authorized Marcus Thompson to begin preparations for potentially extended isolation with a polar bear in close proximity to the facility. The weather change also affected the bear's behavior, with the animal appearing to become more agitated and focused as the storm approached. Wildlife specialists would later explain that polar bears often accelerate their hunting and territorial activities in anticipation of severe weather, driven by instincts that prioritize securing food and shelter before conditions become prohibitive for active movement. Rebecca Walsh's weather monitoring equipment confirmed that the storm system was arriving ahead of the predicted schedule, with winds already reaching 35 miles per hour and sustained snow beginning to accumulate. Her revised forecast suggested that peak storm conditions would arrive within the next 2 hours, potentially creating whiteout conditions that would ground the wildlife response helicopter and leave the facility crew isolated until the weather cleared. At 12 p.m., Dr. Harrison faced a critical decision point. The wildlife response team was still 15 minutes out, but the deteriorating weather conditions raised serious questions about their ability to safely land and conduct bear management operations. Delaying their arrival might mean waiting until the storm passed, which could extend the bear encounter by 12 to 18 hours or more. The decision to maintain normal operations while awaiting professional wildlife assistance reflected Dr. Harrison's assessment that the current situation, while concerning, remained manageable as long as crew members adhered to established safety protocols. The bear had shown no indication of attempting to breach the perimeter fence, and its behavior, while persistent, had not escalated to aggressive actions directed at human activity. Carlos and Ethan used the extended downtime to complete routine maintenance procedures that had been postponed due to operational demands. The work provided a welcome distraction from the wildlife situation while ensuring that drilling equipment would be ready for immediate restart once the bear encounter was resolved. Their methodical approach to the maintenance tasks reflected their professional dedication and their confidence in the facility's security measures. At 12:07 p.m., Officer Martinez radioed the facility to report that weather conditions were approaching the limits for safe helicopter operations. The pilot was willing to attempt landing but advised that departure might be delayed until the storm passed, potentially stranding the wildlife team at the drilling site for an extended period. Dr. Harrison authorized the landing attempt, reasoning that having wildlife professionals on site would provide additional security, even if their departure was delayed. The helicopter's approach was visible from the facility's windows, appearing and disappearing through the increasing snow and wind as the pilot navigated the challenging landing conditions. The aircraft's rotor wash created a temporary whiteout that obscured visibility around the landing pad and temporarily masked the movements of the polar bear that had been under observation for the previous several hours. At 12:13 p.m., the helicopter successfully landed, and the three-person wildlife response team quickly unloaded their equipment and moved toward the facility buildings. Officer Martinez's immediate priority was establishing communication with Dr. Harrison and conducting a comprehensive assessment of the bear's current location and behavior patterns. The team's standard protocol called for establishing a secure observation post and developing a management strategy based on the specific characteristics of the individual animal and the site conditions. The wildlife team's arrival coincided with a temporary break in the snow, providing improved visibility for their initial assessment of the situation. Officer Martinez's experience with Arctic bear encounters immediately recognized several concerning elements in the animal's behavior, including its apparent lack of fear regarding human activity and its systematic investigation of the facility's security perimeter. This bear is displaying classic characteristics of an animal that has lost its natural fear of humans, Officer Martinez explained to Dr. Harrison during their initial briefing. The prolonged observation period, combined with the active testing of barriers, suggests an individual that may be preparing for more aggressive investigative behavior. The wildlife team's equipment included specialized tranquilizer guns designed for large Arctic mammals, bear deterrent devices ranging from noisemakers to pepper spray systems, and emergency medical supplies for treating potential bite or claw injuries. The helicopter also carried equipment for transporting a sedated bear to a more appropriate release location, assuming weather conditions permitted flight operations. At 12:30 p.m., the bear's location was temporarily lost as increasing snow and wind created visibility challenges for the security camera system. Marcus Thompson's manual observation from various facility windows failed to locate the animal, raising concerns that it might have moved closer to the buildings or found a sheltered position that obscured it from view. The loss of visual contact elevated the alert status and required enhanced security measures for any necessary outdoor activities. Officer Martinez's decision to conduct a limited exterior reconnaissance reflected the balance between gathering essential information about the bear's location and minimizing human exposure to potential danger. Equipped with a tranquilizer gun and accompanied by one of her team members, she planned a brief perimeter survey to re-establish visual contact with the animal and assess its current behavioral state. The reconnaissance mission, scheduled to begin at 12:45 p.m., was postponed due to rapidly deteriorating weather conditions that reduced visibility to less than 50 yards. The storm system had arrived ahead of schedule and with greater intensity than predicted, creating whiteout conditions that made outdoor operations extremely dangerous for both wildlife management activities and normal facility operations. Dr. Harrison's decision to implement storm protocols reflected the dual challenges of managing both wildlife and weather emergencies simultaneously. Storm protocols required securing all exterior equipment, ensuring adequate fuel supplies for extended heating operations, and establishing communication schedules with outside authorities. The presence of a polar bear in the immediate vicinity added complexity to these routine procedures and required modifications to account for the wildlife threat. At 1 p.m., the facility's emergency generator automatically engaged as high winds affected the primary power supply from the main drilling operation. The generator's diesel engine created additional noise and activity that potentially could attract further bear attention. But the alternative of operating without reliable power during a storm was considered unacceptable given the crew's safety requirements and the need for heating, lighting, and communication systems. Carlos and Ethan found themselves with unexpected free time, as both drilling operations and routine maintenance activities were suspended due to the combined weather and wildlife emergency. They spent the time reviewing technical manuals and discussing advanced drilling techniques, using the forced downtime as an opportunity for informal professional development. Their conversation revealed Carlos's growing confidence in Arctic operations and his appreciation for the complex challenges that characterized polar industrial work. "I've learned more about drilling in the past week than in 6 months of traditional operations," Carlos told Ethan as they reviewed hydraulic system schematics. "There's something about the extreme conditions up here that forces you to really understand your equipment instead of just operating it." Ethan's response reflected his own professional journey and his recognition of Carlos's potential for advancement within the Arctic drilling industry. "The Arctic doesn't tolerate shortcuts or assumptions," he explained. "Every system has to work perfectly because there's no backup plan when you're this far from civilization. That discipline makes you a better engineer overall." At 1:15 p.m., a brief lull in the storm provided temporary improvement in visibility, allowing Marcus Thompson to conduct a visual sweep of the facility perimeter from the security office. His observation revealed no immediate sign of the bear, but tracks in the fresh snow indicated that the animal had moved closer to the main buildings during the period when visibility had been obscured. The new track pattern showed that the bear had approached to within 10 feet of the dining facility's exterior wall and had spent time investigating the building's foundation and lower windows. Most concerning were claw marks on the exterior wall near one of the ground-level windows, indicating that the bear had been actively testing the building's structural integrity and looking for potential entry points. Officer Martinez's examination of the claw marks confirmed her worst suspicions about the bear's behavioral progression. These marks indicate a bear that has moved beyond passive curiosity into active problem-solving mode, she explained to Dr. Harrison. The systematic investigation of potential entry points suggests an animal that may be preparing for more aggressive action. The wildlife team's assessment led to a recommendation for immediate evacuation of the facility if weather conditions permitted helicopter operations. However, the continuing storm made flight operations impossible, leaving the crew with no option but to maintain their current defensive posture, while hoping that the bear would lose interest and move away from the facility. At 1:30 p.m., Dr. Harrison authorized the activation of the facility's emergency beacon, which would alert rescue authorities to the developing situation and ensure that additional resources would be available once weather conditions improved. The beacon's activation represented a significant escalation of the emergency response and reflected the growing concern about the crew's safety as the bear's behavior became increasingly bold. The emergency beacon transmitted GPS coordinates, facility status information, and a brief description of the current emergency situation to the North Slope Borough Emergency Management Center in Utqiagvik. The transmission initiated automatic notification procedures that would alert additional wildlife authorities, emergency medical services, and potential search and rescue resources to the developing situation. Rebecca Walsh's continued weather monitoring indicated that the storm would likely continue for at least 4 more hours before conditions improved sufficiently to permit helicopter operations. This timeline meant that the crew would remain isolated with the polar bear for an extended period, during which the animal's behavior could continue to escalate toward more aggressive actions. At 1:45 p.m., the bear's location was re-established when it appeared at the main entrance to the dining facility, apparently investigating the double-door entry system that served as the primary access point to the building. Security cameras captured footage of the animal manipulating the door handles with its claws and applying pressure to the door structure in what appeared to be a systematic test of the entry system's integrity. The bear's investigation of the main entrance represented a significant escalation in its behavior, moving from perimeter surveillance to direct interaction with human-occupied structures. Officer Martinez's immediate assessment was that the animal had progressed to the point where it represented an imminent threat to crew safety and required immediate intervention despite the challenging weather conditions. "We can no longer assume that this bear will simply lose interest and move away," Officer Martinez announced to the assembled crew members who had gathered in the dining facility's central area. "The behavior we're observing indicates an animal that has made a decision to investigate this facility as a potential resource, and we need to be prepared for the possibility that it will attempt to gain entry." The wildlife team's emergency protocols for dealing with aggressive polar bears in confined situations included several options, ranging from deterrent devices to lethal force. But all of these options required the ability to safely engage the animal from an appropriate distance. The current weather conditions and the bear's position at the main entrance complicated any potential intervention strategy. At 2 p.m., Dr. Harrison made the decision to begin evacuating crew members from the dining facility to the more secure drilling control building, which featured reinforced construction and fewer potential entry points. The evacuation required careful coordination to avoid creating movement and noise that might further attract the bear's attention, while ensuring that all personnel were accounted for and relocated to the more defensible position. Carlos and Ethan were among the first group of crew members selected for relocation, reflecting Dr. Harrison's assessment that their technical expertise would be essential if the situation extended into a prolonged siege scenario. The drilling control building contained the facility's primary communication systems and backup power supplies, making it the logical choice for a fallback position if the bear succeeded in breaching the dining facility. The relocation process required crew members to move approximately 30 yards between buildings, a distance that exposed them to potential bear attack for approximately 15 to 20 seconds per person. Marcus Thompson and Officer Martinez established overwatch positions with tranquilizer guns to provide protection during the movement, while other crew members maintained visual surveillance to ensure the bear's location was known throughout the evacuation process. Carlos's movement between buildings occurred without incident, but his first direct view of the polar bear at close range provided a visceral understanding of the threat they were facing. "I had no idea they were so massive," he told Ethan once they reached the safety of the control building. "Seeing it on camera doesn't prepare you for the reality of something that size and powerful." Ethan's own reaction to seeing the bear reflected his years of Arctic experience and his understanding of polar bear capabilities. "They're the ultimate predators in this environment," he explained to Carlos. "Everything about them is designed for killing and surviving in conditions that would kill us in minutes without protection." At 2:15 p.m., the bear's attention shifted from the dining facility's main entrance to the building's windows, which provided visual access to the interior and potentially represented alternative entry points. Security footage showed the animal rearing up on its hind legs to investigate windows approximately 8 feet above ground level, demonstrating both its impressive size and its problem-solving capabilities. The bear's window investigation revealed a critical vulnerability in the facility's design specifications. While the windows were constructed with reinforced glass designed to withstand Arctic weather conditions, they were not intended to resist the concentrated force that a polar bear could apply with its claws and body weight. Officer Martinez's assessment indicated that the bear could potentially breach the window barriers if it made a determined effort to do so. At 2:30 p.m., the decision was made to complete the evacuation of all personnel from the dining facility to the drilling control building. This process required moving 23 remaining crew members across the exposed area between buildings, a logistical challenge that consumed nearly 45 minutes and required constant coordination between security personnel and wildlife specialists. During the evacuation process, the bear's behavior became increasingly agitated, possibly in response to the increased human activity or changes in the facility's activity patterns. The animal began vocalizing with the distinctive huffing and growling sounds that polar bears use to express territorial dominance and aggressive intentions. These vocalizations, clearly audible even through the storm winds, added a psychological element to the stress experienced by crew members during their relocation. Rebecca Walsh was among the final group of personnel to be evacuated, and her movement between buildings coincided with a temporary intensification of the storm that reduced visibility to near-zero conditions. During the 40 seconds required for her transit, visual contact with the bear was lost, creating several moments of extreme tension as security personnel attempted to maintain protective coverage without being able to see either Rebecca or the potential threat. At 3:15 p.m., all personnel had been successfully relocated to the drilling control building, which now housed 46 people in a space designed for normal occupancy of 12 to 15 individuals. The crowded conditions created challenges for maintaining morale and managing resources, while the limited sightlines from the control building reduced the ability to monitor the bear's activities around the abandoned dining facility. Officer Martinez's assessment of the drilling control building's defensive capabilities identified several advantages compared to the dining facility, including reinforced construction designed to withstand industrial accidents, fewer potential entry points, and better sightlines for defensive positioning. However, the building also presented challenges including limited food and water supplies for extended occupation and heating systems that might not be adequate for supporting the current occupancy levels. The wildlife team's contingency planning focused on maintaining defensive positions while awaiting improved weather conditions that would permit either helicopter evacuation or more aggressive bear management interventions. Their assessment indicated that the current situation could potentially extend through the night and into the following day, depending on the storm's duration and the bear's behavioral choices. At 3:30 p.m., security cameras revealed that the bear had successfully entered the dining facility through a window that it had broken using a combination of claw and body pressure techniques. The animal's entry into the building represented a significant escalation of the emergency and demonstrated its determination to investigate the human facility regardless of barriers or deterrents. The bear's behavior inside the dining facility, captured on internal security cameras, showed systematic investigation of food storage areas, cooking equipment, and waste disposal systems. The animal's actions were deliberate and methodical, indicating high levels of intelligence and problem-solving ability as it explored the unfamiliar environment and searched for anything that might represent food resources. Dr. Harrison's immediate response to the bear's building entry was to declare a Level 1 emergency, the highest alert status available under the facility's emergency protocols. This declaration triggered automatic notification procedures to corporate headquarters, regulatory authorities, and emergency response agencies, ensuring that maximum resources would be mobilized to assist with the developing crisis. Officer Martinez's assessment of the situation indicated that the bear's successful entry into the dining facility had fundamentally changed the threat dynamics. We're now dealing with a bear that has learned that human structures can be breached and that human facilities contain resources worth investigating, she explained to Dr. Harrison. This knowledge makes the animal significantly more dangerous in future encounters. At 3:45 p.m., the bear began systematically destroying equipment and furniture in the dining facility, apparently frustrated by its inability to locate substantial food resources. The destruction included overturning tables, tearing apart storage cabinets, and damaging kitchen equipment in what appeared to be an expression of territorial dominance over the newly claimed space. The sound of destruction from the dining facility was clearly audible in the drilling control building, despite the storm winds, creating additional psychological stress for crew members who could hear their temporary home being systematically dismantled by the polar bear. Carlos found the sounds particularly disturbing, as they provided an audio track to what was happening without the visual information that might have made the situation more comprehensible. "It's the not knowing that gets to you," Carlos commented to Ethan as they listened to the sounds of destruction. "You can imagine all sorts of terrible possibilities when all you have is the soundtrack." Ethan's response reflected his own coping mechanisms developed through years of Arctic work and his understanding of the psychological challenges posed by wildlife encounters. "The important thing is to remember that we're safe where we are right now," he told Carlos. "The bear is investigating a building, not hunting people. As long as we maintain our defensive position, we should be fine." At 4 p.m., Officer Martinez attempted to contact her headquarters in Utqiagvik to provide an updated situation report and request additional resources once weather conditions permitted. However, the combination of storm interference and equipment limitations made radio communication impossible, effectively isolating the facility from outside assistance until atmospheric conditions improved. The communication blackout added another layer of stress to an already challenging situation, as crew members realized that they were completely on their own until the storm passed. Dr. Harrison's leadership during this period focused on maintaining calm and ensuring that resources were distributed fairly among the unexpectedly large population of the control building. Rebecca Walsh's monitoring of weather conditions indicated that the storm was beginning to show signs of weakening, with wind speeds decreasing from their peak levels and snow intensity becoming more intermittent. However, her forecast suggested that conditions would not improve sufficiently for helicopter operations until sometime after 6 p.m., meaning that the crew faced at least 2 more hours of isolation with the polar bear. At 4:15 p.m., The bear's destruction of the dining facility appeared to be winding down, with security cameras showing the animal investigating areas it had already explored and beginning to exhibit behaviors associated with fatigue or loss of interest. Officer Martinez interpreted these signs as potentially indicating that the bear might soon lose interest in the facility and resume its natural movement patterns. However, the wildlife specialist's optimism was tempered by her understanding that polar bears are capable of remaining in promising hunting areas for days or even weeks if they believe that food resources might become available. The bear's successful entry into the dining facility had essentially proven that human structures contained interesting resources, potentially establishing a long-term association between the facility and food opportunities. At 4:30 p.m., crew members in the drilling control building began discussing contingency plans for dealing with an extended siege scenario. These discussions covered topics ranging from food and water rationing to sanitation facilities and sleeping arrangements for nearly 50 people in a space designed for much smaller occupancy levels. Marcus Thompson's security expertise proved valuable in organizing defensive preparations, including establishing watch schedules for monitoring the bear's activities and positioning personnel with tranquilizer guns at strategic observation points. His military background provided a framework for managing the logistical challenges of supporting a large group of people in a confined space under emergency conditions. Carlos and Ethan volunteered for the initial watch shift, positioning themselves at one of the control building's observation windows with binoculars and radio communication equipment. Their assignment involved monitoring the bear's activities in and around the dining facility while maintaining communication with Officer Martinez and other security personnel. At 4:45 p.m., the bear exited the dining facility through the same window it had used for entry and began investigating the exterior of the drilling control building. This development represented the escalation that everyone had been dreading, as it brought the animal into direct proximity with the building containing all of the facility's personnel. The bear's approach to the control building was methodical and deliberate, beginning with investigation of the building's foundation and gradually working upward to examine windows, doors, and other potential entry points. Security cameras captured footage of the animal testing various structural elements with its claws and applying pressure to determine their strength and vulnerability. Officer Martinez's immediate assessment was that the bear's investigation of the control building represented the most dangerous phase of the encounter. The animal has learned that human structures can be breached and contain resources, she explained to Dr. Harrison. Its investigation of this building suggests that it's preparing to attempt entry, potentially putting all personnel at immediate risk. At 5 p.m., Dr. Harrison faced the most difficult decision of his professional career. Weather conditions remained too dangerous for helicopter evacuation, but the bear's behavior indicated an imminent threat to crew safety. The available options included attempting to drive the bear away using noise and deterrent devices, trying to tranquilize the animal despite challenging shooting conditions, or maintaining the current defensive posture while hoping that the bear would lose interest. The decision to attempt bear deterrence reflected Dr. Harrison's assessment that passive defense was no longer adequate given the escalating threat level. Officer Martinez and her team prepared to deploy noisemakers, flares, and other deterrent devices in an effort to convince the bear to abandon its investigation of the control building and move away from the facility. At 5:15 p.m., the deterrent operation began with the activation of compressed air horns and emergency sirens designed to create noise levels that would be uncomfortable for bears and encourage them to seek quieter environments. The initial response was promising, with the bear moving away from the control building and appearing to be startled by the sudden noise. However, the bear's retreat proved to be temporary, and within 10 minutes the animal had returned to its investigation of the control building with apparent determination to continue, despite the noise deterrence. Officer Martinez's experience indicated that the bear's persistence in the face of deterrent devices suggested an individual with either exceptional boldness or desperate hunger that overrode normal caution responses. At 5:30 p.m., the bear began what appeared to be a systematic attempt to breach the control building's main entrance, using its claws to manipulate the door hardware and applying increasing amounts of pressure to the door structure. The building's reinforced construction provided significant resistance, but the concentrated force that a polar bear could apply raised serious concerns about the long-term integrity of the barrier. Carlos and Ethan, maintaining their observation post, had a front-row view of the bear's attempted entry and were able to provide real-time updates on the animal's progress and behavior. The experience of watching a 1,200-pound predator attempting to force its way into their shelter provided both men with a visceral understanding of their vulnerability despite the building's protection. "I can see individual claw marks appearing in the metal doorframe," Carlos reported via radio to Dr. Harrison and Officer Martinez. "The bear seems to understand exactly what it's trying to accomplish, and it's making steady progress." Officer Martinez's response reflected her growing concern about the situation's trajectory and her recognition that more aggressive intervention might soon become necessary. "If the bear succeeds in breaching the door, we'll be dealing with a confined space encounter between a polar bear and nearly 50 people," she explained. "That's a scenario that we absolutely must avoid." At 5:45 p.m., weather conditions finally began to improve sufficiently to consider helicopter operations, with wind speeds dropping below the maximum limits for emergency flight operations and visibility improving as snow intensity decreased. Officer Martinez immediately attempted to contact her headquarters to request emergency evacuation support, but communication systems remained problematic due to atmospheric interference. The improving weather provided hope for eventual resolution of the crisis, but also highlighted the reality that evacuation operations would require considerable time to organize and execute. Even under ideal conditions, helicopter evacuation of nearly 50 people would require multiple trips and several hours to complete, during which time the bear threat would continue to pose immediate danger to anyone remaining at the facility. Dr. Harrison's planning for potential evacuation operations had to balance the desire to remove crew members from danger with the practical limitations of helicopter capacity and the need to maintain essential personnel for facility security and equipment protection. The evacuation priority list placed essential personnel and those with specialized skills in later groups, ensuring that the facility could continue to function with minimal staffing if necessary. At 6 p.m., the bear's attempted entry into the control building intensified, with the animal beginning to use its body weight in combination with claw pressure to stress the door structure. Security cameras captured footage of the bear rearing up on its hind legs and applying downward pressure to the door frame, demonstrating problem-solving behavior that surprised even experienced wildlife personnel. The sound of the bear's assault on the building entrance was clearly audible throughout the control building, creating enormous psychological stress for crew members who could hear the predator's attempts to reach them. Several crew members, including some with previous Arctic experience, began showing signs of acute stress reactions that required intervention from their colleagues and the medical personnel present in the group. Carlos found himself struggling with fear responses that he had never experienced during his years of oilfield work. The combination of confinement, the sounds of the bear's attempts to enter the building, and the realization of their complete isolation created a level of stress that was entirely outside his previous experience. I've been in dangerous situations before, but this is different, Carlos confided to Ethan during a brief moment when the bear's activities had temporarily quieted. In other situations, you can usually do something to improve your situation. Here, we're just waiting and hoping that someone else can save us. Ethan's response reflected his own coping strategies and his understanding of the psychological challenges posed by wildlife encounters. The hardest part is accepting that we're not in control, he acknowledged. Everything we've learned about problem solving and taking action doesn't apply when you're dealing with a force of nature like this. At 6:15 p.m., Officer Martinez made the decision to attempt tranquilizing the bear, despite the challenging shooting conditions and the risk of escalating the animal's aggressive behavior if the tranquilizer failed to take immediate effect. The decision reflected her assessment that the bear's persistent attempts to breach the building represented an unacceptable risk to crew safety that justified the potential risks of intervention. The tranquilizer operation required careful positioning to ensure a clear shot while maintaining sufficient distance to avoid immediate retaliation if the bear's behavior became more aggressive. Officer Martinez selected a shooting position at one of the control building's upper windows, which provided adequate sightlines while maintaining the protection of the building structure. The specialized tranquilizer gun carried by the wildlife team was designed specifically for large Arctic mammals and contained a drug cocktail calibrated for an adult polar bear of the size observed in the security footage. However, the effectiveness of tranquilizer drugs could be affected by factors including the animal's stress level, physical condition, and environmental temperature, making the outcome of any intervention attempt uncertain. At 6:30 p.m., Officer Martinez fired the first tranquilizer dart, striking the bear in the shoulder area as it continued its assault on the building entrance. The bear's immediate response was to turn toward the source of the projectile and emit vocalizations that clearly indicated anger and increased agitation. Rather than showing signs of sedation, the animal appeared to become more focused and determined in its efforts to breach the building. The failure of the initial tranquilizer dart to produce immediate effects created a more dangerous situation, as the bear's behavior escalated from methodical investigation to apparent rage-driven assault on the building structure. The animal began using its full body weight and strength in an apparently coordinated effort to break through the entrance, creating stress levels that threatened the structural integrity of the door system. Carlos and Ethan, observing from their window position, reported that the bear's behavior had fundamentally changed following the tranquilizer dart impact. "It's not just investigating anymore," Carlos radioed to the security team. "It seems to understand that there are people in here, and it's determined to get to us." At 6:45 p.m., the bear succeeded in creating a small opening in the door structure, allowing it to insert its claws and begin working to enlarge the breach. This development represented the crossing of a critical threshold, as it indicated that the building's defenses were no longer adequate to ensure crew safety and that more aggressive intervention was required. Officer Martinez's second tranquilizer dart was fired at 6:47 p.m., striking the bear in the hindquarter area and delivering a second dose of sedative drugs. The combined dosage from both darts should have been sufficient to sedate an adult polar bear within 10 to 15 minutes, but the animal's stress level and apparent determination seemed to be overriding the normal effects of the tranquilizer. Dr. Harrison's emergency decision at 6:50 p.m. was to authorize the use of lethal force if the bear succeeded in breaching the building entrance, despite the preference for non-lethal resolution of wildlife conflicts. The decision reflected his primary responsibility for crew safety and his assessment that the situation had progressed beyond the point where wildlife management considerations could take precedence over immediate human safety. At 6:52 p.m., the bear succeeded in enlarging the door breach sufficiently to insert its head and one front paw into the building interior. This development created immediate panic among crew members, several of whom began attempting to barricade themselves in interior rooms or storage areas. The sight of the polar bear's massive head appearing through the doorway provided a visceral reminder of the predator's size and power. Marcus Thompson, positioned near the entrance with a high-powered rifle, found himself facing the decision to engage a polar bear in lethal combat at extremely close range. His military training had prepared him for combat situations, but engaging a 1,200-pound predator in a confined space represented a unique challenge that was outside his previous experience. At 6:54 p.m., the tranquilizer drugs finally began to affect the bear's behavior, with the animal showing signs of disorientation and reduced coordination. However, rather than retreating from the building, the bear became wedged in the doorway opening it had created, creating a situation where a partially sedated 1,200-pound predator blocked the only exit from the building. The bear's position in the doorway created an extremely dangerous situation for everyone in the building. The animal was too large to be safely removed by human effort, but its location prevented evacuation and made it impossible to use the tranquilizer drug's sedative effects to resolve the conflict. Officer Martinez's assessment was that the situation had become a true emergency, requiring immediate outside intervention. At 6:56 p.m., the first sounds of approaching helicopters became audible over the storm winds, indicating that the weather had improved sufficiently for emergency flight operations and that help was finally arriving. However, the bear's position in the doorway meant that immediate evacuation was still impossible, and the rescue operation would need to include wildlife management components before personnel evacuation could begin. At 6:58 p.m., Carlos Mendoza made a decision that would cost him his life. Seeing crew members trapped in the rear of the building without access to emergency exits due to the bear's position in the main doorway, Carlos attempted to create a distraction that would draw the bear's attention away from the other personnel and potentially allow them to escape through emergency windows. Carlos's action involved moving toward the rear of the building, where several crew members, including Rebecca Walsh and two junior engineers, had become trapped when the bear's entry had blocked their access to the main exit routes. His intention was to create noise and movement that would focus the bear's attention on him rather than on the other trapped personnel. At 6:59 p.m., the bear, responding to Carlos's movement and vocalizations, extracted itself from the doorway opening and turned its attention toward the interior of the building. Despite the effects of the tranquilizer drugs, the animal retained sufficient coordination and aggressive capability to represent a lethal threat to anyone within reach of its claws and teeth. Carlos's final radio transmission, recorded at 7 p.m., consisted of a warning to other crew members to remain in protected positions while he attempted to lead the bear toward an area of the building where it could be safely contained or neutralized. His voice reflected both fear and determination as he implemented what he believed was the best strategy for protecting his colleagues. The bear's attack on Carlos Mendoza began at 7:01 p.m. and lasted approximately 90 seconds. Despite his attempts to maintain distance and use furniture and equipment as barriers, Carlos was unable to evade the polar bear's superior speed and agility in the confined space of the control building. The attack was witnessed by multiple crew members, including Ethan Lowe, who later described it as the most terrifying and heartbreaking thing I've ever seen. Ethan Lowe's decision to attempt a rescue of Carlos Mendoza reflected both his personal friendship with the younger man and his assessment that Carlos might still be saved if immediate intervention was provided. Despite warnings from Marcus Thompson and Officer Martinez to remain in a protected position, Ethan moved toward the bear attack area, carrying a fire extinguisher and emergency medical supplies. The bear's attack on Ethan Lowe began at 7:02 p.m., immediately following the conclusion of its assault on Carlos Mendoza. Ethan's attempt to use the fire extinguisher as both a weapon and a shield proved inadequate against the polar bear's size and strength, and his rescue attempt resulted in his own death within approximately 60 seconds of initial contact with the animal. At 7:03 p.m., Marcus Thompson fired 3 rounds from his high-powered rifle, successfully killing the polar bear and ending its assault on the facility personnel. The shots were fired at extremely close range in a confined space filled with personnel, requiring exceptional accuracy to avoid hitting crew members while ensuring that the bear was immediately neutralized. The deaths of Carlos Mendoza and Ethan Lowe occurred within a 7-minute period that began with the bear's successful breach of the building entrance and ended with Marcus Thompson's lethal intervention. The compressed timeline of the attack sequence left crew members with limited opportunity to implement emergency procedures or evacuation protocols, highlighting the speed with which wildlife encounters can escalate from manageable situations to fatal emergencies. Emergency medical personnel arriving with the helicopter rescue team confirmed the deaths of both Carlos Mendoza and Ethan Lowe at 7:15 p.m., approximately 12 minutes after the attack sequence began. Despite immediate efforts to provide emergency medical treatment, the severity of injuries inflicted by the polar bear made survival impossible for both men. Dr. Harrison's immediate priority following the attack was ensuring the safety of surviving crew members and coordinating with emergency response personnel to establish a secure perimeter around the facility. The presence of a dead polar bear in the control building created additional safety hazards and complicated evacuation procedures for the surviving personnel. The helicopter evacuation of surviving crew members began at 7:30 p.m. and continued for the following 3 hours, with multiple flights required to transport all personnel to medical facilities in Utqiagvik for evaluation and treatment. Several crew members required treatment for shock, hypothermia, and stress-related conditions, while others sustained minor injuries during the chaotic moments of the bear attack. Rebecca Walsh's evacuation occurred during the second helicopter flight, and her initial interviews with the emergency response personnel provided crucial timeline information for investigators attempting to reconstruct the events leading up to the fatal attack. Her geological expertise also proved valuable in explaining the environmental factors that had contributed to the bear's presence in the area. Marcus Thompson remained at the facility until the final evacuation flight, assisting with security operations and evidence preservation for the subsequent investigation. His actions during the bear attack were later credited with saving the lives of the remaining crew members, and his precise shooting in an extremely challenging situation was recognized as exceptional marksmanship under extreme stress. Officer Jennifer Martinez's preliminary report, filed at 11:45 p.m. on November 4, 2024, identified multiple factors that had contributed to the escalation of the wildlife encounter into a fatal attack. These factors included the bear's unusual persistence in investigating the facility, the delayed arrival of wildlife response personnel due to weather conditions, and the animal's success in breaching building defenses that had been designed for deterrence rather than physical protection. The initial investigation into the attack was conducted by a joint team including Alaska Department of Fish and Game wildlife specialists, occupational safety and health administration industrial safety experts, and Alaska State Troopers criminal investigators. Their preliminary findings suggested that the attack represented a confluence of environmental, behavioral, and operational factors that had created an unusually dangerous situation. Dr. Elena Rodriguez's analysis of the bear's behavior, based on security camera footage and witness interviews, concluded that the animal had displayed extremely sophisticated problem-solving behavior and an unusual persistence in investigating human facilities. Her report noted that the bear's actions were consistent with an individual that had previous exposure to human-related food sources, possibly including garbage or improperly stored provisions at other facilities. The autopsy examination of the polar bear, conducted by Alaska Department of Fish and Game veterinary specialists, revealed that the animal was a healthy adult male, estimated to be between 12 and 15 years old, and weighing approximately 1,300 pounds. The bear showed no signs of disease or injury that might have explained its aggressive behavior, and its nutritional status was considered adequate for the time of year. Toxicology analysis of tissue samples from the bear revealed no evidence of exposure to industrial chemicals or other substances that might have affected its behavior. The analysis did confirm the presence of tranquilizer drugs consistent with the darts fired by Officer Martinez, but the concentrations were insufficient to have caused significant behavioral impairment during the attack sequence. The investigation into facility security protocols revealed several deficiencies in the design and implementation of wildlife protection measures. While the facility met minimum regulatory requirements for Arctic industrial operations, investigators concluded that the security measures were inadequate for dealing with a determined polar bear that had lost its natural fear of humans. Corporate response from Transarctic Petroleum Solutions included immediate suspension of operations at the North Star facility, pending completion of the investigation and implementation of enhanced security measures. Company officials expressed condolences to the families of Carlos Mendoza and Ethan Lowe, while emphasizing their commitment to worker safety and environmental protection. The families of both victims retained legal counsel to investigate potential liability issues related to the facility's security protocols and emergency response procedures. Preliminary legal analysis suggested that the case would likely focus on questions of whether reasonable safety measures had been implemented and whether the company had adequately prepared for wildlife encounters in Arctic operating environments. Media coverage of the attack began within hours of the initial emergency reports and continued for several weeks as details of the incident became available through official investigations and witness interviews. The story attracted national attention due to the dramatic nature of the attack and its occurrence in the context of ongoing debates about Arctic industrial development and climate change impacts on wildlife behavior. Environmental advocacy groups cited the attack as evidence of the inherent dangers of industrial development in polar bear habitat, arguing that such operations inevitably create conflicts between human activity and Arctic wildlife. Industry representatives countered that the attack represented an exceptional incident that should not be used to justify restrictions on legitimate economic development in the Arctic. Climate change researchers pointed to the attack as an example of how changing Arctic conditions might be affecting polar bear behavior and increasing the likelihood of human-wildlife conflicts. Sea ice formation delays and changes in prey availability could potentially drive bears to investigate human facilities as alternative food sources, creating increased risks for industrial workers and Arctic communities. The psychological impact of the attack on surviving crew members varied significantly among individuals, with some requiring extended counseling and others demonstrating remarkable resilience in returning to work. Several crew members, including Rebecca Walsh, left the oil industry entirely following the incident, while others requested transfers to non-Arctic assignments. Dr. Michael Harrison submitted his resignation from Transarctic Petroleum Solutions 3 weeks after the attack, citing his inability to continue in a leadership role after the loss of crew members under his supervision. His resignation letter, portions of which were later made public, expressed profound grief over the deaths of Carlos Mendoza and Ethan Lowe, and his belief that different decisions might have prevented the tragedy. The facility itself remained closed for nearly 6 months following the attack, during which time extensive modifications were made to security systems, building construction, and emergency response procedures. The renovated facility included reinforced building construction, enhanced perimeter barriers, and improved communication systems designed to prevent similar incidents in the future. Workers returning to the modified facility underwent additional training in Arctic wildlife awareness and emergency response procedures. The new protocols included mandatory bear safety courses, regular drills for wildlife encounter scenarios, and enhanced coordination with wildlife authorities for ongoing threat assessment and response planning. The annual memorial service for Carlos Mendoza and Ethan Lowe, held each November 4th at the Utqiagvik Community Center, brings together surviving crew members, family members, and Arctic industrial workers to honor the memory of the 2 men who lost their lives in the polar bear attack. The service serves both as a remembrance ceremony and as an educational opportunity for workers entering Arctic industrial employment. Carlos Mendoza's daughter, Elena Maria Santos Mendoza, was born 4 months after her father's death. Maria Santos established a scholarship fund in Carlos's memory to support engineering students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, ensuring that his commitment to education and professional development would continue to benefit future generations. Ethan Lowe's daughter Chloe, now in her teens, has become an advocate for Arctic wildlife conservation and worker safety, speaking at conferences and safety training programs about the importance of understanding and respecting the Arctic environment. Her presentations often include readings from her father's letters, sharing his insights about the beauty and dangers of Arctic work. The regulatory changes implemented following the attack included new requirements for wildlife barrier construction, emergency communication systems, and coordination with wildlife authorities for all Arctic industrial operations. These changes, while increasing operational costs, have been credited with preventing similar incidents at other facilities across Alaska's North Slope. 5 years after the attack, technological developments have led to improved wildlife detection systems that can identify and track polar bears at much greater distances from industrial facilities. These systems provide early warning that allows for proactive wildlife management and reduces the likelihood of surprise encounters like the one that occurred at the North Star facility. The scientific study of polar bear behavior has benefited from the detailed documentation of the North Star incident, providing researchers with unprecedented footage and data about how individual bears investigate and interact with human facilities. This information has contributed to improved understanding of polar bear cognition and decision-making processes. Current polar bear management protocols in Arctic industrial areas reflect lessons learned from the North Star attack, emphasizing early detection, rapid response, and the importance of maintaining adequate wildlife management resources at all facilities operating in polar bear habitat. These protocols have been adopted not only in Alaska, but also in Arctic operations in Canada, Greenland, and other polar regions. The economic impact of the attack extended beyond the immediate costs of facility closure and legal settlements to include broader effects on Arctic development projects and insurance costs for polar operations. Some proposed projects were cancelled or delayed due to increased safety requirements and higher insurance premiums associated with wildlife risk management. Worker recruitment for Arctic positions became more challenging following the media coverage of the attack, with many potential employees expressing concerns about wildlife safety and emergency response capabilities. Companies operating in polar bear habitat have had to invest heavily in safety training and equipment to attract qualified personnel. The long-term environmental monitoring at the North Star site has provided valuable data about polar bear population dynamics and habitat use patterns in the area. This information has contributed to improved understanding of how industrial activities affect Arctic wildlife and how development projects can be designed to minimize human-wildlife conflicts. 10 years after the attack, the North Star facility continues to operate under enhanced safety protocols, and no additional serious wildlife incidents have occurred. The facility serves as a model for Arctic industrial safety, demonstrating that effective wildlife management and worker protection can be achieved through proper planning, adequate resources, and respect for the Arctic environment. The families of Carlos Mendoza and Ethan Lowe have maintained contact with each other and with surviving crew members, creating a support network that continues to provide emotional assistance and practical help for those affected by the tragedy. This network has also served as an advocacy group for improved Arctic worker safety and wildlife protection measures. The story of the November 4th, 2024 polar bear attack serves as a permanent reminder of both the dangers inherent in Arctic industrial work and the importance of maintaining adequate respect for the power and intelligence of Arctic wildlife. The 7 minutes that claimed the lives of Carlos Mendoza and Ethan Lowe have influenced Arctic operations worldwide and continue to shape policies and procedures designed to protect both workers and wildlife in polar environments. Educational programs developed in response to the attack are now mandatory for all workers entering Arctic employment, ensuring that future generations of industrial workers understand the risks and responsibilities associated with working in polar bear habitat. These programs include detailed case studies of the North Star incident and emphasize the importance of following safety protocols and maintaining vigilance in Arctic environments. The research facility established at the University of Alaska Fairbanks to study human-wildlife interactions in Arctic environments was founded with funding provided by Transarctic Petroleum Solutions as part of their commitment to preventing similar tragedies. The facility conducts ongoing research into polar bear behavior, Arctic ecosystem dynamics, and industrial safety measures for polar operations. Memorial gardens dedicated to Carlos Mendoza and Ethan Lowe have been established in both their home communities, providing peaceful spaces for reflection and remembrance. These gardens include educational displays about Arctic wildlife and worker safety, ensuring that their legacy continues to contribute to public awareness about the challenges and risks of Arctic industrial work. The investigation report's final conclusion emphasized that the attack resulted from a unique combination of environmental conditions, wildlife behavior, and operational circumstances that created an unusually dangerous situation. While the specific sequence of events was unlikely to be repeated exactly, the report stressed the importance of continuous vigilance and improvement in Arctic safety measures. The comprehensive review of Arctic industrial safety protocols conducted in response to the North Star attack led to significant improvements in emergency response capabilities, wildlife management resources, and worker training programs across the entire Arctic industrial sector. These improvements have been credited with preventing numerous potential incidents and improving overall safety for Arctic workers. Today, the memory of Carlos Alejandro Mendoza and Ethan David Lowe continues to influence Arctic operations and wildlife management practices throughout the polar regions. Their sacrifice serves as a constant reminder that industrial activity in Arctic environments requires the highest levels of preparation, respect for wildlife, and commitment to worker safety. The 7 minutes that took their lives have created a legacy of improved safety measures that will protect Arctic workers for generations to come, ensuring that their deaths were not in vain, but instead contributed to a fundamental transformation in how humanity approaches industrial operations in polar bear country.